Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere cold, brutal and wildly misunderstood. Viking Age Scandinavia. You've seen the horned helmets, which they didn't wear, the wild longboats cutting through icy waters, the axes gleaming with saga-fueled glory. But tonight, we're peeling back the furs, if you will, and stepping into something darker. Much darker. The real story of S3x in the Viking Age is complicated, raw, and, at times, downright disturbing. Love wasn't always part of the equation. Neither was choice, and as you'll quickly learn, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Helps me keep lighting the fire for stories most people are too shy to ask about. Drop your city and what time it is in the comments. Curious how many night owls are wandering into this frostbitten rabbit hole with me. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Okay, close your eyes. Imagine yourself in a world of thick forests and long, sunless winters. The air smells like smoke and wet fur. You're wearing wool. Everyone's wearing wool. There's a pig tied to a post somewhere, grunting impatiently. And all around you are people, men and women, who carry knives, sleep in shared rooms, and believe in gods who demand both blood and bone. This isn't just a warlike society, it's a deeply sensual one, in ways that are hard to explain and often hard to stomach. S3x in this world isn't a private matter. It's a public negotiation, a political move, a thing tied up with magic, with violence, and with power, that you don't fall in love in a Viking village, you inherit a wife, you trade a daughter. Or if you're less fortunate, you become someone else's bride at sword point. Harsh, very, but this is not the HBO version. This is history with the frost still clinging to it. So let's start with a truth that's somehow both grim and oddly modern. The Vikings, as brutal as they were also obsessed with appearances. They might bathe once a week, scandalous for the time. They carried combs, tweezers and ear spoons carved from bone or antler. They braided their beards and cared deeply about hair. It wasn't vanity. It was signalling, because in a world without Instagram, your body was your resume. Women, for example, were expected to be strong, capable of managing a household, birthing multiple children and carrying water long distances. A plump body was desirable. It meant fertility, strength and prosperity. For men, tallness, broad shoulders and a full beard were ideal. Thin or effeminate-looking men were mocked, even in death. Some Viking sagas go out of their way to insult enemies by calling them womanish. And yeah, that brings us to the first dark edge. Viking society had very clear ideas about what men and women should be, and deviation from that could literally get you killed, or at least socially ruined. Gender was tightly bound to power. A man who acted too feminine, or who didn't exert sexual dominance, could be accused of ergi, a concept with no clean translation, but which basically meant unmanly, cowardly, and sexually passive. Not a vibe you wanted in the Viking social scene. In fact, calling someone arga, the adjectival form, was considered such an extreme insult that you could legally challenge them to a duel for saying it. Yes, duels over being called soft. But let's pull back a bit. Imagine you're a young woman in a Viking village. You're around 15, maybe 16, marriageable age. You've got good teeth, a bonus, healthy hips, a must. And your father has already started accepting offers. You have, at best, a whisper of influence over who you end up with. That's not to say women had zero agency. We'll get to that. But the overwhelming majority of matches were made by the men of the family. And sex? That was baked into the contract. Marriage was both a social alliance and a sexual one. Once the dowry was exchanged and the wedding feasts ended, the marriage was sealed, publicly and sometimes quite literally on the family bed, in a house full of relatives. Privacy was not a Viking value. Now take the opposite angle. You're a Viking man, returning from a raid. You've brought back treasure, silver, cloth, maybe livestock, and yes, people, captives. Enslaved women were part of the spoils of war. They didn't get to choose anything. They were absorbed into households as thralls, which was just a slightly more polite way of saying human property. Their sexual availability wasn't discussed in polite company. It was assumed. These women existed in a grey zone between domestic labour, survival and silent suffering, and if they bore children, the child's status depended entirely on whether the father claimed it. If not, well, infants didn't always survive long in this world. Some were simply left out in the woods. There's no denying that Viking sexuality was violent and transactional, but it was also complex, even spiritual. Norse mythology is laced with eroticism. Freyja, goddess of love and war, was said to sleep with dwarves in exchange for magical jewellery. Loki shapeshifted into a mare and gave birth to an 8-legged horse. Odin practiced magic typically reserved for women, which scandalised some even then. The gods themselves didn't play by mortal rules, and mortals, when invoking them, sometimes blurred lines too. Love magic existed. Erotic charms were carved into wood and bone. People believed in sex dreams that summoned real consequences. Still with me? Good, because none of this was black and white. Some women found power in the chaos, managing households, casting spells, manipulating alliances, and some men fell outside the mould and survived anyway. But the foundation was brutal. Vikings were warriors, not romantics. The idea of love as we understand it, a private, consensual, emotionally fulfilling bond, wasn't the cultural norm. It was the exception. So yeah, next time someone tells you they wish they lived in the Viking Age, maybe ask them if they'd like to be auctioned off at 15, or dragged across the sea in chains. Romance? Not really on the longboat itinerary. So now that you're tucked into your bed and hopefully not questioning your entire ancestry, let's take a deeper look at how the Vikings actually viewed the body. Not just as a tool for survival, but as a symbol, a status marker, and, weirdly enough, a battlefield of honour and shame. Because the Norse didn't just live in a harsh climate. They lived in a world where your skin, your hair, your scent, and even your posture told a story. And if that story didn't align with society's expectations, well, let's just say the outcome wasn't great for you. You're lying on a straw-stuffed mattress in a smoky longhouse right now, and all around you, you can hear the breathing of other people. Parents, cousins, maybe even a stranger or two. Privacy isn't a thing. Everyone sleeps in the same room. Everyone sees everyone else, literally, daily. And it's in this kind of environment that ideas about the body start to take on a different weight. Your body is never fully your own. It's public property. It's your identity, your currency, and, when necessary, your weapon. Here's the kicker. For all the brutality we associate with the Viking Age, these people were actually known throughout Europe for being weirdly clean. Monks in Anglo-Saxon England complained about how often the Norse bathed and brushed their hair. To their enemies, this was borderline suspicious behaviour. Real men weren't supposed to wash so often, were they? But the Vikings? Oh, they loved a good soak. They had hot springs, they had communal baths. Saturday was washing day, and it wasn't optional. They trimmed their beards, filed their nails, and carried grooming kits like it was no big deal. Not because they were vain, but because physical presentation mattered. A lot. Especially in matters of sex, courtship, and social ranking. Picture it. A muscular man steps into a village feast. His hair braided back, his beard oiled, his tunic freshly laundered. He's not just showing off. He's announcing his control over his own body, his discipline, his resources, his worth as a lover and as a leader. If he smelled good, even better. Viking combs and tooth sticks have been dug up all over Scandinavia, tucked into burial sites like sacred tools. Hygiene was virtue. A dirty, unkempt man wasn't just unattractive, he was suspect. Now let's flip it. You're a woman walking into the same feast. Your dress is made of dyed wool, fastened at the shoulders with bronze brooches. Underneath you've got linen, maybe even silk if you're rich enough. Your hair is pinned or braided. Your hands are calloused but clean. If you're unmarried, your body is being quietly appraised by every man in the room, just as you're evaluating theirs. Your posture, your laugh, even the way you pour mead into a cup, it all signals your social value. The fact that you're strong, maybe even stocky, is a plus. Women were expected to endure pregnancy, childbirth, and the chaos of managing a farm or household during war seasons. Thinness? That wasn't sexy. It meant you probably wouldn't survive a harsh winter. Now, there's one little fact here that gets even more interesting. Despite the intensity around physical health and beauty, Viking art rarely eroticizes the human form. You don't find naked statues of gods with glistening abs like you would in ancient Greece. Instead, beauty and sexual allure were shown through metaphor, through birds, ships, weapons, and runes. There are barely any explicit images of people having sex, not because they were modest, oh no, because they believed sex was something powerful, even dangerous. It wasn't something to be displayed casually, it was something to be wielded. Speaking of danger, let's talk about body shame, though there was a lot of it, and it went both ways. For men, looking too effeminate was a major issue. A man with a high voice, narrow shoulders, or a passive stance could be accused of being argreer. And as we mentioned before, that was a serious accusation, one that could land you in court or even in a duel. The fear of being seen as sexually submissive ran deep. Viking masculinity was built on the idea of dominance, in combat, in leadership, and yes, in bed. Women weren't spared either. A woman who was too assertive, too sexual, or too independent could also be shamed. The sagas are filled with insults directed at women who step out of their lane. The term skaldmare, poet maiden, sounds flattering, but it was often a backhanded jab. A woman who composed poetry or spoke too boldly could be viewed as dangerous, possibly even cursed. Beauty and sexuality were assets, sure, but only if used in ways that aligned with the culture's strict codes. Let's take a weird little detour here. Did you know that Viking warriors sometimes filed their teeth? Yep. Archaeologists have found skulls with horizontal grooves carved into the front teeth, possibly filled with pigment. It's not clear why. Was it intimidation? Identification? Ritual status? A very edgy fashion trend? Scholars still argue about it. But if you're thinking, okay, that's hardcore, you're right, and it plays into how the body was seen as a billboard for your reputation. If you were hot, strong, and had the teeth to prove it, you were set. But here's where things get a little foggy. Despite all this emphasis on bodily presentation, we actually don't have a clear idea of how the Vikings defined sexual attraction beyond fertility and strength. Did they have specific preferences? Did they fetishize certain traits? There's debate. Some scholars argue that red hair, for example, was especially prized, tied to the gods like Thor and Freyja. Others say that was more regional. And that height or wealth trumped all physical attributes. There's even disagreement over how much romantic love factored into any of this. Was it just lust and alliance, or something deeper? The sagas are notoriously vague. They speak in riddles. They hint, but they rarely spell things out. And that's the frustrating thing about history, right? We want to know what they felt, not just what they did. But feelings don't fossilize. All we have are bones, carvings, court record, and sagas written down centuries later, long after Christianity started scrubbing the pagan paint off everything. What we can say for sure is that the Viking body wasn't just flesh. It was identity. It was morality. It was power. So when you imagine Viking love scenes, not the steamy leather-clad ones from TV, but the real gritty ones, think less passionate embrace and more social chess move involving meticulously groomed players who've bathed twice this week and might insult each other over soup. Honestly, that's kind of its own vibe. Now that you're thoroughly familiar with how the Vikings sized each other up, based on braids, body odour and biceps, let's get into how they decided what it actually meant to be a man or a woman. Spoiler, it wasn't just about anatomy. In Viking society, gender was performance, obligation, and in many ways, an all-consuming role you had to get right, or else. Strength and submission weren't just personal traits, they were mandates from society, law, and even the gods, and stepping outside those lines, that could get you shamed, outcast, or carved into a saga as a cautionary tale. So imagine this. You're born into a small farming village in 9th century Norway. If you're male, from the moment you can walk, you're handed a wooden sword and told that real men take what they want. If you're female, you're handed a loom or a butter churn and reminded that real women keep what men take alive. It's not that Viking women were weak or voiceless. They could be fierce, commanding, even deadly, but they were expected to exercise that power within strict boundaries. Think of it like a fortress, strong but only as long as it stays in its place. Gender roles were deeply binary. Men were warriors, traders, hunters, and lawgivers. They were supposed to be brave, emotionally restrained, and sexually dominant. Women were the managers of the home, the keepers of the family's honour, and the literal fabric holders of society because yes, spinning and weaving weren't just chores, they were acts of status and symbolism. A well-woven tapestry could display wealth, lineage, and even encode stories or curses. Being good at it was political. But here's the twist. For all the gender rigidity, women actually had more legal rights in Viking culture than in many other parts of medieval Europe. They could own property, initiate divorce, and demand compensation if their honour was damaged. There are records of women attending court, arguing cases, and negotiating deals. Sounds progressive, right? Almost utopian if you squint hard enough. But wait, those rights existed as long as the woman conformed to her role as wife, mother, and keeper of virtue. Step outside that, and those same courts could strip her of everything. There's one recorded law from medieval Iceland, still considered part of the broader Norse world, that spells it out. If a woman dressed like a man and carried weapons, she could be exiled. Not just fined or scolded, literally driven out of the community. And exile in Viking society wasn't a dramatic, I'll just live in the woods situation. It was social death. No protection, no trade, no survival. So if a woman dared to cross the gender line, she'd better have a ship and a few friends with axes. And speaking of blurred lines, let's talk about the shieldmaidens. You've seen them in shows, warrior women slicing through enemies, hair flying, eyes glowing with rage. But were they real? That's the scholarly debate still raging today. Some sagas mention women who fought in battles. The most famous is Lagertha, a warrior described in Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, who was said to fight with her hair flying over her shoulders and carried a sword like a man. But Saxo wrote in Latin centuries later, and with a heavy Christian bias. He didn't approve of these warrior women. He described them as unnatural, calling them seductresses and freaks. More recently, in 2017, archaeologists analysed the bones from a famous Viking burial in Birka, Sweden, long assumed to be a male warrior grave because of the weapons and game pieces buried with the body. Turns out the skeleton was biologically female. Cue the headlines. Shieldmaiden confirmed, but even that sparked controversy. Critics argued that just because a woman was buried with weapons didn't mean she fought with them. Maybe she was buried with her husband's items. Maybe it was symbolic. The truth? We may never know. But let's say for a second that shieldmaidens did exist. That would make them outliers, rare exceptions, not the norm. For every Lagertha, there were 100 women managing farms, raising kids, spinning wool, and doing all the invisible labour that kept Viking society from collapsing. And within that system, gender performance was strictly monitored. Men were supposed to be dominant in every way, physically, sexually, emotionally. A man who cried too easily or submitted to a woman was mocked, or accused of being arg, the insult we talked about earlier. And yes, being called arger didn't just question your masculinity, it questioned your moral worth. It was deeply tied to the sexual culture. To be arger was to be sexually deviant, which in Norse logic meant allowing yourself to be the passive partner. Even in consensual relationships, the man on the receiving end of sexual acts could be ridiculed or accused of witchcraft, effeminacy, or perversion. This wasn't just about same-sex relationships either. Even heterosexual encounters could raise eyebrows if the power dynamic was wrong. A man dominated by his wife? Argir. A man who lost a fight and begged for mercy? Also arger. It's honestly exhausting. Imagine having to uphold this performance 24/7 just to be considered a functioning adult. The stakes were high and the punishments for stepping out of line weren't just social, they could be legal. A slander case over calling someone arger could lead to an actual duel, or full-on legal dispute in the Thing, the Viking legal assembly. This wasn't just playground name-calling, it was warfare by words. And yet, there were moments when the system cracked. Some women found ways to wield power, sometimes even bending gender roles without breaking them. A widow, for instance, could command huge influence, especially if her sons were too young to rule. Some women took religious roles as volur, seeresses, who were both feared and respected. These women dressed differently, spoke in riddles, and were considered close to the gods. Ironically, their power came from stepping outside femininity, but only under sacred protection. And then there were men who practiced Sida, a form of Norse magic associated with the goddess Freyja. This was deeply gendered magic, considered woman's magic, and men who practiced it were both feared and despised. Even Odin, the All-Father, was accused of being arger for using it. Think about that. The king of the gods himself wasn't safe from this label. It shows you just how embedded gender expectations were, even among the divine. So to sum up tonight's little moral lesson, in Viking society, gender was a script, written by your ancestors, enforced by your neighbours, and carved into law with blood and bone. Men who failed to dominate were humiliated. Women who dared to lead were exiled, or immortalised as legends. And everyone, every day, had to perform strength or submission, depending on the body they were born into. Not exactly your average Tinder bio, right? Alright, now that you've got your head wrapped around Viking gender roles, rigid, brutal, and somehow still more flexible than you'd expect, let's talk about marriage. But not in the romantic way, not the will you marry me under the northern lights kind of thing. No, in the Viking Age, marriage was a contract, a straight-up business transaction. Love was optional, land was not, honour was everything. So imagine yourself standing in the middle of a windswept fjord valley, surrounded by sheep, relatives, and the faint smell of smoked fish. You're about to get married, and it's less about butterflies and more about balance sheets. In Viking society, marriage wasn't about two people, it was about two families, or more specifically, two male heads of household making a mutually beneficial deal. Fathers, uncles, brothers, they were the real matchmakers. A woman could sometimes voice her opinion, and a man could theoretically reject a bride he didn't want. But in reality, family alliances, landholdings, and local politics were the real factors in choosing a spouse. Your feelings about it were secondary, maybe even irrelevant. Let's say your father wants to ally with a neighbouring farmstead. His land borders theirs. There's been tension, maybe a feud, or maybe they've got better grazing rights. So he offers your hand in marriage as a peace deal. Your dowry, your heimfylgja, might include some sheep, a few silver coins, and a decent portion of the household textiles. In return, your groom's family gives a bride price called the munda, which goes not to you but to your father. Yes, that's right. Your marriage starts with your body being priced like a prize cow and your dad cashing the check. Romantic, no. Now, this wasn't just an informal barter. These deals were recorded, witnessed, and often celebrated with days of feasting. Contracts might be spoken aloud or scratched into wood or stone. And once the deal was struck, the woman was transferred, literally, from her father's household to her husband's. She changed her loyalties, her duties, even her gods in some cases. She became the keeper of her new family's hearth, and soon enough the producer of heirs. Here's where it gets even more complex. While the woman left her family, she still retained some power. If she came from a strong lineage, she might bring status with her. Her dowry remained hers, legally. In most cases, she could reclaim it if the marriage ended. And if her husband died, she might even become the head of the household. That's when a woman's legal independence really started to show. Widows could own property, sue in court and arrange marriages for their children. But until that point, she was largely expected to submit, serve, and survive. Now, let's talk about the wedding night. You might imagine some kind of cosy, candlelit consummation ritual. The truth was more public and, let's be honest, more invasive. There's debate among historians, but many believe the couple's first night together was expected to be witnessed, or at least audibly verified. You heard that right. People might be listening at the door to make sure the marriage was sealed. Some sagas even suggest the couple was escorted to bed with torches and cheered on by drunk uncles like some twisted linen-draped sports event. Because a marriage wasn't valid without sex. That was the literal definition of consummation. No pressure or anything. But what if the groom couldn't perform? What if something went limp? That could become a legal issue. A woman could divorce her husband on grounds of impotence if he failed to consummate the marriage within a set period, usually 3 years, though this varied. There are even tales of women humiliating their husbands publicly, describing their failures in court. So for a culture that expected men to dominate, a failure in the bedroom wasn't just embarrassing, it could be socially and legally devastating. And yes, divorce was absolutely a thing. Viking women had more divorce rights than most European women for centuries. If a husband mistreated his wife, was unfaithful, or just plain didn't hold up his end of the bargain, she could walk. One popular way to do this. She could announce her divorce in front of witnesses at the household's threshold, citing her reasons and reclaiming her dowry. No judge, no church, just a declaration and done. Viking men could do the same, though often for different reasons, like barrenness or disobedience. Let's sprinkle in a fringe fact here. There's some evidence that in rare cases people renewed their marriage vows annually during a winter festival called Yule, like a romantic audit. Still married? Great. Want out? Cool. It's a bit fuzzy in the records, but it's an idea that pops up in some later sagas and folk traditions. If true, it would mean Viking couples had more options for re-evaluation than we give them credit for. But let's not pretend this was utopia. Many marriages were deeply unequal. Age gaps were common, and girls could be married off as young as 12 or 13. Marriages were often arranged for political gain, not affection. And while a woman could, in theory, divorce her husband, the social consequences could be harsh, especially if she had no male relatives to back her up. A divorced woman without family protection was vulnerable. Easy prey, she might be forced to remarry quickly, become a concubine, or worse. Then there's the darker side, forced marriages. Raiding and capturing women was a common Viking practice, and marriage by capture was disturbingly normalised. If a man abducted a woman during a raid and brought her back as his wife, it wasn't necessarily seen as immoral, especially if she was of lower status or from an enemy tribe. Some sagas even romanticize these events, with the woman falling for her captor over time. But let's be clear, that's not love. That's survival psychology dressed up in saga poetry. And yet, despite all of this, there were glimpses, just glimpses, of something like affection. A handful of gishkas speak of love matches, a man fighting to win the hand of the woman he desires, a woman defying her father's choice to follow her heart. These stories are rare and probably exaggerated, but they're there, tucked into the ice-crusted edges of Viking lore like forgotten letters. So if you're still fantasizing about marrying a Viking, just remember, unless you're a land-owning widow with a sharp tongue and a sharper dagger, you're probably just a pawn in someone else's game of honour and property lines. That fur cloak might be warm, but the marriage bear, not so much. So, you've survived the wedding feast, the awkwardly monitored wedding night, and the charming realisation that you were mostly a bargaining chip between two families. But let's say you don't want to be the wife waiting by the fire. Let's say you want a sword, a horse, and your name etched into a saga. You want to be a shield maiden. Now we're entering one of the most hotly debated corners of Viking history, half legend, half bone-deep truth. And spoiler, no one agrees on whether these women really existed. But tonight, you're going to walk in her boots anyway. You're standing at the edge of a battlefield. You can smell blood and pine smoke in the air. Around you, men shout prayers to Odin, axes clashing against shields. And there you are, your hair braided back, dressed in armour that isn't exactly flattering but definitely functional. You've trained in secret, you know how to wield a sword. You've learned how to throw a spear without breaking your wrist. And today, you're not behind the longhouse spinning wool, you're in the front line. At least that's how the sagas tell it. Let's be real. Shield maidens are Viking mythology's favourite wild card. They show up in tales like the Hervarar saga, Saxo Grammaticus's Gesta Danorum, and the saga of the Volsungs. Names like Brynhilda, Lagertha, and Hervor pop up, warrior women who fight like men, lead armies, and sometimes even die with swords in hand. Saxo, who was writing in the 12th century, long after the Viking Age ended, tells us about entire bands of warrior women. But here's the twist. He clearly hates it. He writes about these women as unnatural, shameful, and morally chaotic. He calls them immodest, accuses them of abandoning womanhood, and generally treats them like a sign that the world's going to hell in a handbasket. So why include them at all? Scholars still argue about it. Maybe these stories were based on real women who broke norms, fought in battles and earned reputations. Maybe they were symbolic, representations of female rage, vengeance, or divine intervention. Or maybe they were just wish-fulfillment stories, not unlike your average Hollywood heroine, written to shock and titillate readers who'd never seen a woman carry a sword outside a church mural. Then came the 2017 bombshell. Archaeologists re-examined a famous grave at Birka, Sweden, that had long been assumed to belong to a high-status male warrior. The burial included a full set of weapons, 2 horses, and a gaming board, typically symbols of tactical prowess. But DNA testing revealed the bones were biologically female. Boom! The media lost its collective mind. Shield Maiden proven real, the headlines screamed. And yes, it was huge. But the academic world, being what it is, immediately got into a brawl over the interpretation. Some argued that just because she was buried like a warrior doesn't mean she fought like one. Maybe she was symbolic. Maybe she was the wife of a warrior and buried with his things. Others pointed out that if a man had been buried in the same setup, no one would question his status. It was a very sounds like internalized bias to me moment in Viking studies. Still, even the loudest skeptics admitted the find was compelling, and there are more than a few clues scattered through Viking art and graves. Female skeletons with battle wounds, weaponry found in what seemed to be female plots, and depictions of women holding swords in iconography. Not conclusive, but suggestive. So where does that leave you, aspiring shield maiden? Well, If you were born into the right kind of family, maybe with no brothers to take over, you might be raised a bit differently. You'd learn to ride, to hunt, to manage men. And in times of war, especially during home raids or invasions, you might be forced to fight. Not as a soldier per se, but as a defender. In some sagas, women stand on rooftops hurling stones and boiling water at attackers. It's not battlefield glory, but it's survival. Also, let's talk about vengeance. That's where female violence really shows up in the sagas. If a woman's husband or father is killed, she might demand revenge, and not just emotionally. There are stories of women literally handing swords to their sons and refusing to let them eat until they avenge the family. In some tales, when the men won't act, the women do it themselves. And those moments, brief, fierce, and bloody, are where you glimpse the real fury that might have inspired the idea of shield maidens in the first place. Now, you might be wondering, if shield maidens were real, why weren't there more of them? Why aren't there detailed records of their exploits? The answer is brutally simple. History was written by men, mostly Christian men. And they were not exactly into celebrating women who wielded swords and shattered patriarchal norms. They either erased them or turned them into moral lessons. Look how unnatural this is. Let's never let that happen again. Classic. And yet the image of the shield maiden refuses to die. She's all over modern Viking media. TV shows, novels, cosplay conventions. But in the real Viking Age, she would have been a disruption, a challenge to the hierarchy. She might have existed, but if she did, she was probably seen as both powerful and deeply dangerous. A woman with a sword wasn't just violating gender roles, she was messing with the cosmic order. She was stepping into the realm of the gods where violence and fate entwined like snakes in a knot. Here's a quirky little detail. In some poetic texts, shield maidens are compared to Valkyries, the mythic women who choose who lives and dies on the battlefield. And some scholars believe that shield maidens were modelled on these divine figures, not the other way around. So maybe shield maidens weren't historical figures who became myths, but myths that some bold, real-life women tried to live up to. And honestly, that's kind of beautiful. It means that somewhere in those long winters and blood-stained summers, there might have been women who defied the script, who picked up a blade, strapped on a shield, and fought for something bigger than survival. Not often, not safely, but enough to echo through time. So as you lie there tonight under your blanket, imagining the clang of iron and the howling wind outside a mead hall, remember this. In the Viking world, power belonged to the strong. But sometimes the strongest people were the ones history tried hardest to forget. So you're adding now. You've either been married off like a prize goat, or maybe, if you're feeling rebellious, you've picked up a shield and taken your chances on the battlefield. But let's talk about something that didn't require a feast or a funeral to happen. Something far more everyday, uncomfortable, and frankly, disturbing. Tonight we walk into one of the darkest chambers of the Viking Age. Consent, or more often the complete absence of it. Now, to be fair, modern concepts of consent didn't really exist back then. That's not to excuse anything, it's just how the world operated. Power dynamics weren't just tilted, they were fully toppled onto anyone with less social leverage. And when it came to S3x duel encounters, the rules weren't based on desire or respect, they were based on status, ownership, and who could win or survive the exchange. Let's rewind a bit. Picture yourself on the deck of a Viking longship. You've just raided a coastal village, maybe in England, maybe in Ireland. There's fire in the distance, blood on your tunic, and your crew is cheering as they drag livestock and loot onto the ship. And among the plunder, people, captives, women, maybe some children, sometimes men, these weren't just prisoners. They were commodities. And once brought back home, many were forced into lives as thralls, basically slaves, and yes, they were considered sexually available to their captors. Viking society didn't see this as controversial. In fact, the idea that a victorious warrior had a right to his spoils, including the bodies of captives, was so normalised it rarely even showed up as shocking in the sagas. It just was. If you were taken in a raid, your identity vanished. You became someone else's property, stripped of your name, your god, and your freedom, including your freedom over your own body. And if you think this was rare, think again. Viking raids weren't just about getting rich. They were also about replenishing labour and disturbingly fertility. Scandinavian society was surprisingly dependent on imported women, not just for farm work, but for childbirth. Some settlements had severe gender imbalances, especially in newer colonies like Iceland or the Danelaw territories in England. So what did they do? They took women. And the logic was cruelly simple. If you couldn't convince women to come to your icy homeland voluntarily, you just grabbed them. And yet here's the unsettling twist. These women often ended up married, or something close to it. After a few years of captivity, if they survived, some were folded into the household. Their children might be considered legitimate if the man acknowledged them. In some cases, these women became the matriarchs of entire lineages. There are Icelandic genealogies that trace family lines back to women whose names are never recorded. Just of an Irish woman, or a captive taken from the Hebrides. That's it. That's all she gets. Her entire life reduced to a footnote in some Viking's brag book. Now let's pivot slightly. What if you weren't a thrall but a local woman? Free, technically, but still caught in a web of power you couldn't escape? Maybe a young girl from a neighbouring village. Maybe you're promised to a man twice your age. Maybe you're courted by a chieftain who doesn't take no very well. In this world, consent is often indistinguishable from coercion. You don't say yes because you want to. You say yes because refusing might mean disgrace, punishment, or your family losing standing in the community. There's one grim Old Norse law code that lays it out plainly. It states that if a woman was raped in an isolated place, the man should be punished. But if it happened in a town or among others, and she didn't scream for help, then it wasn't considered rape. Think about that for a second. The onus wasn't on the man to behave, it was on the woman to perform the correct level of panic. And if she didn't, well, tough luck. Maybe it wasn't really against her will, now you might be thinking, okay, but were there any protections at all? Technically, yes. S3x assault was punishable under Viking law on paper. A man who forced for a free woman could be fined or outlawed. But the key word there is free. If the woman was a thrall or a foreigner, the law didn't care. There was a massive distinction between people and property, and enslaved women fell squarely into the latter category. As for women testifying against their attackers, good luck. In most regions, a woman's word wasn't enough to convict a man, unless other witnesses backed her. And who's witnessing a crime that no one wants to admit happened? Let's get a little fringe with it now. There are scattered references to something called brudhlaup, a sort of bride run ritual, in some wedding customs. The bride would be chased or symbolically abducted before being brought to the groom's bed. Scholars still debate whether this was literal or metaphorical, but even if it was just symbolic, it shows how deeply ideas of forced submission were baked into the culture's concept of union. The woman doesn't walk to the marriage bed, she's taken there. But not everything was unchecked violence. There were cases, documented in lore and saga, where women fought back, where communities sided with them, where punishment was delivered. Sometimes outrage over a forced encounter could spark a blood feud, with brothers, fathers, or sons seeking revenge. And in rare stories, women themselves took vengeance. One saga tells of a woman who castrated her assailant in his sleep. It's probably fictional, or at least highly stylized, but it shows that people knew how wrong these acts were, even if justice was a luxury only some could afford. Now let's zoom out to a broader scholarly debate. Some historians argue that Viking culture, while violent, didn't normalize S3x violence more than other medieval societies, that it was just as common and just as tragic elsewhere. Others insist the Viking Age was uniquely brutal, with its combination of raiding, slavery and warrior culture creating a perfect storm for abuse. The truth is somewhere in the middle. But it's clear that for many women, especially enslaved or foreign ones, the Viking Age was a time of constant threat, where sex wasn't something you gave, it was something taken, and yet, we romanticize it, because history has a way of sanding down the edges until we're left with leather-clad fantasy characters brooding by firelight. But when you start reading between the lines of the sagas, into the bones unearthed from mass graves and the laws scratched into old stone, the truth surfaces like a corpse from a fjord. Consent, in this world, was often a luxury, and survival meant adapting to a system that treated your body as a tool, a currency, or a prize. So next time someone waxes poetic about Viking freedom and strong women, you might want to ask, strong how? Strong enough to carry water all day? Strong enough to give birth alone in a longhouse? Strong enough to smile at the man who took everything from you because there's nowhere else to go? Yeah, strong but not free. Let's take a deep breath. You've trudged through raiding parties, arranged marriages, enforced gender roles, and the bleak absence of consent. So tonight, we're shifting gears just a little. into the misty, slightly weirder corners of Viking life. Because while S3x in the Viking Age was often transactional and violent, it also had a strange magical edge. That's right, love spells, fertility rituals, enchanted amulets, and sorcery that could curse your ex or lure your crush. Welcome to the shadowy world of Viking S3x magic, where what you do in bed might not be nearly as powerful as what you whisper into a carved rune by candlelight. First, picture this. It's the dead of winter. Snow's piling up against the longhouse walls. You've run out of firewood and possibly out of patience with the man snoring beside you. What do? If you're lucky or desperate, you seek out someone with knowledge of Seda, the Norse magical practice that lived somewhere between prophecy, healing, manipulation, and raw chaos. A vulva, a seeress, might chant spells over you, burn strange herbs, and summon spirits to bring your lover home. Or more disturbingly, to bind someone's desire against their will. You wouldn't be alone. Magic wasn't fringe in Viking culture. It was feared, yes, but also deeply woven into everyday life. People turned to it when the gods were silent, when logic failed, or when they just really needed a guy to stop sleeping with his other wife and remember that you embroidered his cloak. Love magic existed, and it was almost always gendered. Women were seen as the primary users of seductive sorcery. That might sound empowering, but it wasn't always flattering. Using magic to influence love or lust was often viewed as suspicious, unnatural, or downright dangerous. Here's a quirky little fact. In some poems and sagas, women used galder, magical chants, to affect men's desires. These weren't sweet lullabies. They were full-blown whisper-to-the-gods incantations designed to stir longing or pain. Some spells were designed to make a man impotent if he betrayed a woman. Others were to make him fall so deeply in love he'd abandon everything, including his honour. One such spell involved carving runes into a piece of whalebone, soaking it in blood and burying it under a man's bed. Yes, that's real. And no, it's not subtle. Runes, by the way, weren't just alphabetic characters. They were symbols of power. Carving them in a certain pattern and speaking the right words could create charms or curses. Archaeologists have found runesticks with messages like, "I cut runes of desire," or "May she never sleep unless it's with me." Romantic? Kinda. Creepy? Definitely. But it shows how obsessed the Norse were with controlling emotions, especially when it came to love and S3x. And speaking of control, let's talk about fertility. In a society that relied on surviving children to keep your farm, your family name, and your afterlife plan afloat, fertility wasn't just personal, it was sacred. Enter Freyja and Freyr, the divine siblings of desire and abundance. Freyr was often associated with an enormous, his statues were anatomically expressive. Temples dedicated to him may have included fertility rituals, although it's debated how literal these were. Some accounts, written by horrified Christian missionaries, claimed that people performed public S3x acts during seasonal festivals to bless the land and ensure crops grew. Scholars still argue whether that's exaggeration, slander, or some uncomfortable truth. Freyja, meanwhile, was the goddess of love, war, and magic. A woman could call on her to increase fertility, stir passion, or end a rival's happiness. Some sagas describe women laying offerings at Freyja's altar, necklaces, carved figures, even blood, to ask for help in love. There are stories where she sleeps with dwarves in exchange for magical jewellery, reinforcing the idea that S3x was transactional even among the gods. But don't get the wrong idea. Freyja wasn't shamed for it. She was powerful because of her sexuality. That alone made her unique in a culture where mortal women were punished for much less. Now, let's enter the real Twilight Zone. Shape-shifting and dream magic. In some traditions, a person could send their spirit or dream self to seduce, spy on, or attack someone else in their sleep. Think of it as lucid dreaming meets psychological warfare. One saga tells of a man plagued by dreams of a woman lying beside him, whispering secrets and stealing his will. He wasted away in real life until she was banished through ritual. Another tale flips the script. A man casts a spell so his lover can't dream of anyone but him. Yeah, even the Viking version of ghosting was terrifying. But here's the scholarly catch. How much of this is metaphor? And how much is literal belief? Some argue these magical seduction stories were stand-ins for emotional obsession. Others believe they represent real magical practices, learned rituals passed down among women or outlawed shamans. Either way, It shows how uncontrollable desire, whether falling into it or falling victim to it, was one of the few forces that could rival steel in the Viking imagination. And just like everything else in Norse society, magic had rules. Men could use it, but at a cost. Practicing cedar was considered woman's magic, and any man who did so was at risk of being labelled agra. Remember that word? It meant unmanly, sexually submissive, shameful. Even Odin, the god who learned cedar from Freyja, got dragged in the myths for it. His enemies taunted him for stooping to women's work, even though his magical powers helped him manipulate fate itself. So again, we see this tension. S3x power was allowed, but only if it followed strict gender codes, crossed the line, and even the gods paid a price. Now let's talk amulets. Viking graves have turned up all sorts of little charms shaped like miniature hammers, Thors, figurines, and, yes, phallic objects. Some were clearly fertility talismans. Others? Possibly meant to ward off impotence or infidelity. You might wear one around your neck or bury it beneath a bed. No one was out here handing out purity rings. People accepted that S3x existed, mattered, and sometimes needed divine assistance to go right. And here's one last fringe gem for you. In some parts of Viking society, particularly out in the islands or rural territories, women were known to brew love beer, an ale spiced with herbs and possibly enchanted through spoken spells. This drink might be served during courtship or to reignite passion in a fading marriage. Of course, whether it actually worked is anyone's guess, but in a world where you couldn't swipe right, magical alcohol was a decent plan B. So as you drift off tonight, think about the quieter side of Viking intimacy, the whispered chant, the carved rune buried beneath a threshold, the hair tied in a lover's amulet. S3x wasn't just flesh, it was fate. And love, when it wasn't bruising or brutal, was something you tried to call out of the wind with the right words spoken under the right moon. Just be careful who you ask for help. Because in the Viking Age, magic always had a price, and love, most of all, could get you burned. Alright, let's take this ride even deeper. We've seen love spells whispered in the dark, marriages arranged like livestock deals, and the messy reality of consent and conquest. But what happens when one woman isn't enough? What happens when a powerful Viking man, chieftain, trader, warlord, decides he wants more than one wife? Welcome to the murky world of polygamy and concubinage in Viking society, where the lines between privilege, property and power get blurry real fast. So picture this. You're the wife, the first wife. You were married off at 15 to a respected landowner, and you've done everything right. Managed the household, born 3 children, embroidered an entire stargate into a wall hanging, and somehow kept the sheep alive through 2 brutal winters. And now, surprise, he's decided to take another woman into the household. Not necessarily as a legal wife, maybe as a concubine, maybe as a second wife in the eyes of custom, if not law. Either way, you're suddenly sharing your bed, your home, and your husband's attention. Polygamy in the Viking Age wasn't the norm for everyone. Most people simply didn't have the resources for it. One wife was already a huge economic investment. But for the elite, jarls, kings, wealthy traders, it wasn't uncommon to have multiple women under one roof. And no, it wasn't romantic. This wasn't a dreamy ménage à trois where everyone gets along and takes turns doing the chores. This was a hierarchy, a power dynamic, and most of the time only one woman held the official title of wife. The others, they were something else. Let's get technical. The Norse didn't have a single term for concubine the way we do now, but there are references to frilla, women kept in relationships outside of formal marriage. Sometimes these were voluntary. Maybe the woman hoped to rise in status, or maybe she simply didn't have better options. More often, they were enslaved or semi-enslaved women forced into sexual relationships without any true choice. In other words, concubine might sound like a fancy title, but in most cases, it just meant a woman who didn't have the legal protections of a wife, and was likely acquired in war, trade, or purchase. Now, in some rare cases, a concubine could become a wife. If the man decided to free her and formalize the relationship, she might be elevated to full household status. But even then, things got dicey. Children born to concubines could be claimed by the father, especially if the wife was infertile. But if the children weren't acknowledged, they had no inheritance rights, which meant you as a concubine were always living in a fragile reality. One shift in favour, one new wife, and your entire existence could be erased. And let's not pretend this was some secret, shameful arrangement. These relationships were public. Everyone knew, everyone saw, and often mocked. It was the first wife who had to manage the day-to-day friction of living alongside her husband's other women. Some households had separate sleeping areas, but many did not. It wasn't unusual for multiple women to raise children under the same roof, children who might be half-siblings, competitors for inheritance, or awkwardly aware of their different origins. So how did the wives feel about all this? Well, there's a spectrum. Some accepted it as the cost of wealth and status. Others wielded their authority to make the other women's lives miserable. In one saga, a wife burns her husband's concubine alive in a fit of jealousy. In another, a concubine poisons the wife and tries to take her place. It's all very Game of Thrones, except, colder and with more sheep. But beneath the drama, what you see is the lived tension of a system built on uneven foundations, where women's worth was constantly measured, compared, and often decided by the whims of one man. And here's the strangest part. Even as this system dehumanized women, it also gave some of them real leverage, if they played the game well. A favoured concubine could become the real power behind the throne. Her children, if legitimized, could inherit land, command men, or even become kings. So that's not hypothetical. There are known rulers in Norse history with questionable maternal lines, rising to power despite the scandal. It was all about whether the father claimed them, protected them, and gave them the tools to rise. Let's toss in a fringe fact. In some Scandinavian cultures, concubines weren't just for the living. There are burial sites where multiple women are buried alongside one man, raising all kinds of eyebrows. Were they wives, concubines, sacrificial companions? It's hard to say. One particularly eerie site in Denmark contained the body of a high-status man surrounded by female skeletons, some showing signs of trauma, others carefully arranged with jewellery. Scholars still argue about what this means. Was it voluntary death to join him in the afterlife, murder dressed up as ritual, or simply a snapshot of one man's social reach in life and death? Now here's where it gets a little murkier, and a little more debated. Some scholars argue that Viking polygamy wasn't true polygamy in the formal multi-marriage sense. They say it was more like serial monogamy mixed with socially accepted concubinage. Others insist that some men absolutely considered themselves married to more than one woman at once, even if only one was recognised legally. The sagas reflect this inconsistency, with characters referring to multiple wives who clearly weren't equal in status. The laws too are inconsistent, some protecting a concubine's children, others ignoring them altogether. But either way, what's clear is that Viking households could be chaotic, emotionally charged environments where women competed not just for affection, but for survival. Your place in the household determined your security, your children's future, even your access to food and clothing. You weren't just fighting for love, you were fighting for life. And let's not forget the men in all this. Maintaining multiple women wasn't just a bedroom fantasy, it was a logistical nightmare. More mouths to feed, more social tension, more legal headaches. A man who couldn't keep order in his own house risked losing face in the community. That's why the first wife often held enormous power. She could manage the finances, oversee the labour of the other women, and even influence whether the concubines stayed or were cast out. In some stories, it's the wife, not the husband, who decides the fate of the other woman. So tonight, as you drift off, imagine that longhouse full of half-light smoke and tension. Picture the women sitting at separate looms, the children whispering behind hanging furs, the man pretending he's in control of it all. There's love here maybe, jealousy definitely, but more than anything there's strategy. Because in a world where men had many women, each woman had to find her own way to survive. And some of them, they didn't just survive, they ruled. Let's not kid ourselves. If you cheat in the Viking Age, you're not getting sent to therapy or served divorce papers by a softly weeping spouse. No, this isn't the era of emotional healing and shared custody. This is the land of honour killings, public shaming, and, occasionally, the literal acts. Tonight we're stepping into the shadowy world of adultery in Norse society, where betrayal wasn't just a breach of trust, it was a direct threat to your household, your name, and sometimes your life. Now imagine this. You're a married woman in a modest farmstead. Your husband's been off sailing for months, probably sleeping with some poor Irish captive he picked up on the coast. But here you are, back home, holding down the longhouse, managing the animals, feeding the children, and wondering why the neighbour's son suddenly looks a little too good in the morning fog. Maybe things happen, maybe someone saw, or maybe someone says they did. In this world, that's enough to ruin you. Because in the Viking Age, adultery wasn't just personal, it was legal. It's there in the Gragas, the medieval Icelandic law code. If a married woman was caught sleeping with another man, she could be divorced immediately, beaten, or even killed by her husband or male relatives. And no, this didn't always require proof. Accusation was often enough, especially if the woman had enemies, or a husband looking for an excuse to trade her in for a newer model. But wait, it gets even more bleak. If a man caught another man in the act with his wife, he was legally allowed to kill them both, right there. No trial, no questions. This was known as a quick verdict, and it was seen as defending one's honour. However, if he spared the man and just killed the wife, that could land him in court. Not because it was morally wrong, but because, get this, the man had violated his property, and the proper punishment was to target the rival. Killing the wife was wasteful, a social faux pas, if you will. Now flip the roles. What if you're the wronged wife? Your husband's been sneaking off to visit a younger woman, or, more likely, has taken a concubine and keeps her in plain sight like she's another goat in the pen. What can you do? Surprisingly, you have some options. Viking women, especially in Icelandic law, could divorce their husbands for infidelity. It was one of the few legally accepted reasons for separation, especially if the concubine lived in the same house. But exercising that right came with risks. Divorcing your husband meant losing the household, risking retaliation, and possibly ending up landless unless you had strong family backing. So yeah, you could leave, but you'd better have a good plan. And let's not ignore the ever-watchful eye of society. Gossip could be fatal. If enough people whispered that you were loose or unfaithful, your reputation would wither. And in a world where your status as a woman was tied to honour, modesty and marriageability, that kind of stain didn't wash off. Some sagas describe women being forced to publicly confess their affairs, naked, head-shaved, standing on the threshold of the house they were being cast out of. Others don't even bother with trials, just a quick swing of the sword and an unmarked grave. But here's where it gets even weirder. Not all affairs were punished equally. Men cheating on their wives was generally tolerated, especially if it was with a slave or concubine. That wasn't considered adultery, that was considered Tuesday. As long as he didn't flaunt it too much or fall too hard for the other woman, no one batted an eye. But if he started treating his concubine like a wife, giving her jewellery, letting her sit at the table, putting her children ahead of his real ones, that could spark legal action from his wife. She could take him to court for dishonouring the household, and potentially walk away with the dowry. So yeah, double standards were very real. A man's wandering was tolerated, even expected. A woman's, on the other hand, was a form of social collapse, and that collapse could extend to her children. If she had a child outside of marriage, especially if paternity was in doubt, the child might be denied inheritance, or even abandoned entirely. Illegitimate children were technically allowed to live, but socially they were ghosts, visible, tolerated, but never truly welcome. Now here's a little fringe fact for you. Some Viking settlements used what were essentially public rumour boards. Wooden markers were carved with accusations, curses, or insults, some scrawled with accusations of adultery or indecency. Imagine walking through your village and seeing your name etched into a post that says something like, "Brynhilda took 2 men to bed while her husband was away." It wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous, because public shame often came before private violence. And if you're wondering whether women ever used accusations strategically, oh yes. A rival might accuse you of adultery not because it happened, but because it would ruin you. And proving innocence, that wasn't exactly easy in a society where courts were made up of your neighbours and relatives, and most decisions boiled down to who's more believable. Trials didn't involve evidence as we know it. You might be asked to swear an oath, or bring in a certain number of supporters to back your claim, but if your social capital was low, or if the man accusing you had higher status, you were done. Here's where things get spicy, and by spicy I mean deeply uncomfortable. In some rare sagas, men boast about seducing married women as a way to humiliate their rivals. This wasn't about love or lust, it was about dominance. To sleep with another man's wife was to prove he was weak. You had conquered his household from within. It was a form of social warfare, and while it could get you killed if you got away with it, your legend grew. Sound toxic? Absolutely. But that's the Viking Age for you, where even S3x could be weaponized like a spear. Now, not every case ended in blood or exile. Some ended in bitter silence. private arrangements, quiet divorces, shame that never left the hearth. And occasionally, very occasionally, people looked the other way. Love affairs did happen. Some sagas even romanticised them. Secret glances across the mead hall, hidden meetings in the woods, whispered vows beneath the northern lights. But those were the exception, not the rule. More often, love had to hide in the shadows because the light brought consequences. So tonight, as you lie there wondering whether you'd survive a Viking breakup, remember this. In a world ruled by reputation and clan, cheating wasn't a fling. It was a battle, a betrayal, a possible death sentence. And unlike modern drama, there were no reality shows, no angry texts, and no couples counselling. Just a blade, and a very public shame. All right, time to tread carefully. We've talked about arranged marriages, concubines, jealousy-fueled vengeance, and enough legal nightmares to make a Viking divorce lawyer very wealthy, if such a person existed. But now we're entering the basement of the Longhouse, metaphorically speaking, the place people whispered about but rarely named out loud. This is the forbidden territory, the taboos. Because as wild and unrestrained as the Viking Age seems, even they had boundaries, and crossing them didn't just lead to social ruin. Sometimes it ended with exile, execution, or being wiped from memory entirely. Let's start with the big one, incest. Not the accidental kind where you marry your fourth cousin and only find out at the wedding feast. We're talking about the real deliberate stuff that even the sagas, brimming as they are with murder, betrayal, and Odin knows what, rarely touched her directly. But here's the uncomfortable truth, it happened. In fact, some of the old myths and heroic tales seem to flirt with it. Take the saga of the Volsungs, for example. In it, the hero Sigmund and his sister Sinni sleep together, yes, actual siblings, to produce a son who will be strong enough to avenge their family. It's framed as tragic, intense, even noble. But also deeply unsettling. The act is justified within the story as necessary to restore honour, which tells you something bizarre about the way kinship, revenge and bloodlines were entangled in Norse thought. It wasn't romantic, it was ruthless. Now that's a myth. So what about real life? Well, Viking law codes were very clear on this one. Incest was illegal. Marriage or sexual relations between close relatives were forbidden, and if discovered, could result in hefty fines, shaming or worse. But defining too close varied from region to region. First cousins were usually off limits, but again, that depended on local custom. And in rural areas where the gene pool was shallow, enforcement was, let's say, relaxed. If your family tree looked more like a wreath, it wasn't great, but it also wasn't always criminal. The fact that it was codified shows how seriously it was taken when lines were clearly crossed. In Iceland's Gragas, sex between siblings or with one's child was punishable by outlawry, meaning the guilty party was banished and could be killed on sight if they returned. That's not just awkward at family dinners, that's full-on erasure. Your name gone from records, your home taken, your life forfeit. But we're just getting started. Let's slide into something even more taboo. Bestiality. You didn't think we'd go there, did you? Well, neither did the Vikings, at least not in public. But here's the thing, they had laws against it. Which means it must have happened. And yeah, it was treated as a capital offence. The Norse law books don't mince words. If someone was caught having sex with an animal, both they and the animal were to be killed. Burned, actually. Executed and destroyed like a cursed relic. There was no trial, no leniency, just cleansing fire. Why so extreme? It wasn't just disgust, it was fear. Crossing that line wasn't seen as just perverse. It was an offence against the gods, against nature itself. It meant disturbing the sacred order of the world, and the only way to fix that was total annihilation. The person, the animal, the shame, they all had to be erased. And here's where things get twisted. Bestiality accusations were sometimes used as weapons. Just like being called Arga, accusing someone of committing a forbidden act with animals was a fast track to ruining their life. You didn't need evidence, you just needed influence. Once that rumour spread, it stuck like frostbite, and in some sagas, such insults led to duels or blood feuds. Now, we're not done yet. There's another category of taboo that lived in the shadows, necrophilia. Yeah, go ahead and wince. We all did. It's not often talked about, but certain mythological texts hint at it. Usually in the context of witches, undead creatures, or spirits being violated or violating others. While there are no surviving Norse laws specifically targeting necrophilia, The cultural horror surrounding death and the sanctity of burial suggests that any such act would have been treated as a monstrous abomination. It wasn't taboo because it was immoral, it was taboo because it desecrated the bridge between the living and the dead. And here's a scholarly rabbit hole for you. Some Viking burial practices involved elaborate rites to secure the corpse, binding the segs, placing scissors or needles in the grave, or driving stakes through the body to prevent them from rising. While this mostly suggests fear of revenants, undead beings, some believe it also protected the body from post-mortem violation. A fringe theory, sure, but in a culture where superstition, magic and death were tightly knotted together, you can't rule anything out. Let's change the tone for just a second with a slightly lighter, though still eyebrow-raising fringe fact. Vikings loved dirty jokes. In fact, they carved some into runestones. One runestone from Sweden reads something along the lines of, Thorgauter carved these runes while his girlfriend watched and laughed. Okay, maybe not scandalous by the modern standards, but it shows that S3xuality wasn't always deadly serious. There was room for humour, innuendo, and even public flirtation, so long as it didn't threaten honour, status, or the fragile structure of society. But back to the dark stuff, because it's bedtime after all. One of the most haunting things about Viking taboos is how rarely they were spoken about directly. You don't see long passages in sagas detailing the crimes. You see silences, gaps, hints. Someone is suddenly exiled without explanation. A family name disappears. A warrior is called filthy or unclean with no context. These narrative absences are the literary equivalent of someone whispering behind a curtain. You don't need to see what happened to know it was awful. And that's the thing, Viking society may seem lawless, but it was actually obsessed with order. It had rules for everything, how to inherit land, how to insult someone, how to duel, how to cook, how to bury the dead, how to be. And breaking those rules, especially the ones about S3x, didn't just make you deviant, it made you inhuman. It turned you into a creature outside the tribe, outside the gods, outside memory. So tonight, as you lie safe and warm in your very non-communal bed, be grateful you're not living in a world where a rumour can exile you, where a wrong touch could lead to fear, and where some lines once crossed meant disappearing from the story entirely. The Vikings told sagas of heroes and monsters, but the worst monsters were the ones no one dared to name. By now, you're probably wondering how we even know any of this. Who wrote it down? Who remembered? How do we go from the torchlit whispers of a longhouse to modern historians piecing together sagas, laws and gossip like they're reading the juiciest medieval tabloid? Tonight, we take a quiet but necessary detour into the written record, or lack thereof, because the Viking Age didn't leave us a crystal clear diary of sexual customs. What we have instead are fragments, sagas written long after the fact, legal codes filtered through Christian eyes, poetry that speaks in riddles, and graves that don't talk, unless you know how to listen. So let's set the scene. You're a Viking in the 800s. You can't read, no one around you can either. Maybe someone knows how to carve runes on wood or stone, but that's more for labelling a sword or cursing your ex than chronicling your personal bedroom drama. Written language isn't yet for storytelling. Oral tradition rules here. That means everything, the heroics, the betrayals, the seductions, the scandals, are passed down by word of mouth. Around the fire, over mead, whispered between spinning wheels or shouted in the heat of a blood feud. And here's the catch. Oral tradition doesn't preserve truth. It preserves meaning. Stories are edited, reshaped, exaggerated, or softened depending on the teller. If someone was caught doing something shameful, their role in the saga might simply vanish. If someone broke a taboo, they might be transformed into a villain, a monster, or erased entirely. And even when stories were eventually written down, mainly in Iceland, centuries later, they were often coloured by Christian moral frameworks. So now we're looking at Viking life through a very particular lens, one that frowns on pagan sexuality, magic, and gender non-conformity. Take the Islendingasögur, the Icelandic family sagas. These were written in the 13th and 14th centuries, long after Christianity had taken root, but they supposedly depict events from the 9th and 10th centuries. They're fascinating, layered, and sometimes shockingly candid. You'll find moments of sexual tension, insults involving masculinity, marriages built on deception, and women who know exactly how to wield their power in bed and at the law court. But what's missing? Details, descriptions, motivation. Sagas almost never give us what modern readers crave: emotional interiority. No, she felt trapped in her marriage, or he secretly loved his male friend but dared not say it aloud. Instead, you get cryptic summaries. They lay together often, or he spoke harshly to her, or her reputation suffered after the feast. That's it. And from those crumbs, historians are left squinting into the dark, trying to reconstruct the emotional lives of people who died over 1,000 years ago. Then there's the poetry, skaldic and Eddic, which is even more confusing. Imagine Shakespeare, but drunk, cryptic, and obsessed with ravens and spears. These poems use kennings, which are metaphorical phrases meant to describe something indirectly. So instead of penis, you get serpent of delight. Instead of making love, you get battling on the Bed Sea. It's poetic, it's dramatic. It's also maddening, because unless you already know what the metaphor means, it's like trying to decode a dream, written in another language by someone who's never heard of Freud. Still, these poetic fragments give us hints. They show us that S3x was seen as a powerful, even dangerous force, that masculinity and dominance were tightly linked, that women who were sexually bold were both admired and feared, and perhaps most tellingly, that insult culture was drenched in sexual imagery. If you really wanted to ruin someone's reputation, you didn't call them weak. You called them passive. Or worse, you said they had been on the receiving end of something they shouldn't have been. But let's pause for a fringe fact. One of the more bizarre sources of sexual information comes not from Viking Scandinavia, but from their enemies, Christian monks. These guys were horrified by the Norse and documented their habits in what can only be described as medieval fan fiction fueled by moral panic. The Northmen bathe every week, one monk gasped, as if that were an obscenity. Others wrote about how Vikings combed their hair and wore bright clothing, and, worst of all, seduced Christian women with their shocking hygiene. These writings were meant to paint the Norse as sinful and savage, but ironically, they gave us some of the best outsider insights into Norse appearance and flirtation rituals. Just take it all with a grain of salt, and maybe a full salt block. Now let's get archaeological. What can bones, burials and artifacts tell us? Quite a bit, and not nearly enough. For example, we found erotic carvings on some artifacts, tiny figurines with exaggerated anatomy, fertility amulets shaped like phalluses, or decorative objects that look suspiciously like they belonged in someone's private drawer. But interpreting these finds is tricky. Were they used in rituals? Carried as jokes? Tools for seduction? Early versions of protection charms against impotence? We don't know. Archaeologists are like distancers at a crime scene with no witnesses and a dozen red herrings. We also find strange burial combinations, men and women buried together, in ways that suggest companionship or even intimacy. Though again, the interpretation depends on the assumptions of the person digging them up. Are they lovers, siblings, master and thrall? One man was found buried with 2 women along with weapons and food offerings. Was this a symbolic family unit? A man with 2 wives? Or something darker, 2 concubines sacrificed to follow him into the afterlife? And then there are the silences, the glaring lack of evidence in certain areas. We have almost no direct written accounts of how people talked about sex day to day. No letters, no journals, no "Dear diary, my husband is insufferable and I'm in love with the blacksmith." Just sagas and law codes, both of which were written by men, about men for the purpose of preserving male-dominated social order. That brings us to the scholarly debate still raging today. Some historians argue that Viking culture was shockingly open about sexuality, just not in the ways we recognise, that they embraced certain kinds of same-sex desire, magical seduction, or non-monogamous arrangements as long as honour remained intact. Others argue the opposite. The sagas show a society obsessed with control, where sexual transgression led to shame, violence, or exile. And honestly, both might be true. Cultures aren't consistent, people aren't predictable, and the Viking world, especially when filtered through centuries of Christian editing, is a blurred reflection of what actually was. So tonight, as you let your eyes close and your mind wander, picture a cold, firelit room full of secrets, a woman weaving by lamplight, a man carving runes into a stick with trembling fingers, a skald composing a poem about love he's not allowed to speak of. We may never know the exact words they whispered, or the truths they hid beneath their metaphors, but we know they felt, we know they feared, we know they desired, and in that they're not so different from us. By now you've probably figured out that Viking women weren't the helpless damsels pop culture sometimes makes them out to be. They weren't all shield maidens either. swinging swords and snarling across battlefields. Most lived somewhere in between, powerful within the home, vulnerable in public, capable of incredible resilience, but always operating inside a framework designed by and for men. So tonight, we're zeroing in on women's rights in the Viking Age. And yes, they existed. Kind of. Sort of. Occasionally. Like most things in this era, it's complicated, conditional, and occasionally pretty impressive, until it isn't. Let's start with the good news. Compared to their medieval European sisters, Viking women had a surprising amount of legal autonomy. They could inherit land, they could own property, they could manage their own finances, represent themselves in court, and, under the right circumstances, divorce their husbands. Sounds great, right? Progressive, even. But before you go applauding Viking society for its forward-thinking feminism, here's the asterisk. Most of that power only applied to women of a certain class with the right connections, and only when their male guardians weren't around to override them. So imagine you're a freeborn woman in 10th century Iceland. Your father dies and leaves you a bit of land, some silver, and a solid reputation. You can keep the land, you can run the farm, you can take a case to the local thing, that's the Viking legal assembly, not a monster, though some of the men there probably qualify as both. But the moment you marry, that property usually transfers to your husband's control unless you negotiate really well, which some women did. They weren't just passive pawns, the smart ones made marriage contracts with the specific clauses to protect their assets. Think of it as a medieval prenup scratched into vellum or spoken aloud in front of witnesses who may or may not have been sober. And yes, you could leave your husband under certain conditions. Adultery, abuse, neglect, or just general incompetence might give you grounds. The process wasn't simple. You had to publicly declare your divorce at the threshold of your shared home, listing your reasons loud enough for others to hear. Kind of like a live-action Yelp review with way higher stakes. If you didn't follow the protocol exactly, the divorce might not count, and you'd still be stuck with the man who couldn't manage his goats or keep his hands to himself. Still, that's more freedom than many women had in feudal Europe, where leaving your husband could get you branded a heretic or tossed into a convent. Viking women could remarry, reclaim their dowries, and sometimes even improve their social standing through a second or third marriage. But again, all of this came with limits. The second you stepped out of bounds, socially, sexually, politically, you risked losing everything. Let's talk about another arena of power. The home. The longhouse wasn't just a place to sleep, it was a complex, socially layered universe. And Viking women ran it. They were in charge of food production, textile creation, childcare, healing, and sometimes even managing hired hands or thralls. A good wife was expected to be both nurturing and terrifying. If a man left for a raid, he needed to trust that his home wouldn't collapse without him. In that way, women were seen as the spine of society, unseen from the battlefield, but absolutely essential. And they didn't just rule quietly. The sagas are filled with fierce, sharp-tongued women who manipulate events from the sidelines. Take Aud the Deep-Minded, a powerful widow who led her family to settle in Iceland. She built her own house, distributed land to her followers, and held public feasts that rivaled any male chieftain. Or Gudrun Osvifsdotter, a woman in the Laxdæla saga who marries 4 times, manipulates her husbands and sons, and eventually becomes a powerful religious figure. These weren't damsels, they were tacticians. But even the strongest women were never fully safe. Their rights were always subject to social standing, the goodwill of their male relatives, and later, religious transformation. Enter Christianity. By the end of the Viking Age, Christian morality was seeping into Scandinavia like cold seawater through a leaky hull. And with it came a new vision of womanhood, one that emphasized chastity, obedience, and submission. Suddenly, a woman's value wasn't in her skill at managing land or influencing politics. It was in her purity, her humility, and her quiet service to God, a real downgrade if we're being honest. Still, it's worth noting that Christian women found new types of power, just not the kind you could swing a sword with. Some became abbesses or saints, others used the church to claim moral authority over their households. But for many Norse women, the arrival of Christianity marked the slow erosion of rights their grandmothers had once held. Now for a weird little fringe fact. Archaeologists have found female graves containing keys, often large, symbolic ones made of iron or bronze. These weren't just practical items, they were status symbols, signifying the woman's authority over the home and property. In some cases, The size and decoration of the key suggest ritual importance, almost like a badge of office. You weren't just the woman of the house, you were the keeper of its secrets, resources and legacy. And once those keys were buried with you, that power was meant to go with you into the afterlife. But here's the hard truth. Not all women were wives with keys and land. Most were poor, many were thralls. Their experiences weren't recorded in sagas. They didn't have legal recourse, they didn't own property, they were property. And their stories, for the most part, are lost, erased by the same systems that praise strong women only when they followed the rules. There's still debate among scholars about how equal Viking women really were. Some point to the legal rights, the bold saga heroines, the archaeological finds and say, look, early feminism. Others look at the violence, the concubinage, the total dependency on male protection, and say, please don't romanticize a deeply patriarchal society just because some women had swords. The truth, as always, lives in the middle. So tonight, as the wind howls through your mental longhouse, think of those women, some noble, some nameless, sitting at the gloom, plotting in court, whispering to spirits, managing entire economies while their husbands played war. They weren't free, but they weren't powerless either. And in a world as cold and chaotic as the Viking Age, that in itself was a kind of rebellion. Let's be honest, there's the one question modern audiences always circle back to when it comes to ancient cultures. What about same-sex relationships? And when it comes to the Vikings, the answer is a tangled knot of fear, honour, myth, and one extremely uncomfortable word, ergi. Tonight we're stepping into the complex, often contradictory realm of homosexuality in Viking society. Not the sanitised, rainbow flag version, but the raw, reputation-destroying, whisper-it-in-the-dark kind of same-sex desire that was both feared and obsessively policed. Now, first off, we've got to say it. The Vikings didn't categorise sexuality the way we do. They didn't have a word for gay or straight. Desire wasn't labelled, it was judged based on roles, actions and social standing. What mattered wasn't who you slept with, but how you did it. And most importantly, whether or not your actions challenged the sacred Norse hierarchy of dominance. Because in Viking culture, status wasn't just about wealth or strength. It was about being seen as the active force in any relationship, including the sexual ones. Enter ergi, one of the ugliest accusations in the Old Norse vocabulary. It roughly translates to unmanliness, but it's so much deeper and more brutal than that. Being called argia, the adjective form, was the medieval equivalent of being socially dismembered. It implied that you were weak, cowardly, sexually submissive, and worst of all, that you might have let another man penetrate you. That last bit wasn't just taboo, it was soul-rotting. It meant your masculinity was nullified, your honour erased, and your place in society permanently degraded. And here's the ironic part. The man who did the penetrating, he wasn't necessarily shamed. In fact, if anything, he was seen as asserting dominance, especially if his partner was of lower status, say a slave or an enemy prisoner, which is exactly as dark and disturbing as it sounds. Same-sex acts weren't judged equally. They were dissected based on power. The person on top, aggressive, commanding, potentially cruel, but still a man. The person on the receiving end, well, he might as well grow a spindle and start weaving. Let's break this down with an imaginary but perfectly plausible scene. So you're a Viking man of decent standing, you have a wife, some land, a respectable beard. But rumours begin to spread. Whispers that during your trip to the east you engaged in something unmanly. Maybe it was a joke that got out of hand. Maybe someone's trying to ruin you. Maybe you were drunk, and someone's boasting now about what you let happen behind that tavern in Novgorod. It doesn't matter if it's true. The accusation alone is a bomb, so what do? You challenge your accuser to a holmgang, a duel. Because calling a man Arga was so serious it could only be resolved by violence. You win, and maybe the whispers die down. You lose? Well, now you're not just dead, you're dead and disgraced. Your family lives with the stain. Your enemies toast your fall. Your saga, if one's ever written, will leave your name out entirely. That's how deep this ran. Masculinity was guarded with a kind of obsessive paranoid fervour. And yet there are hints, shadows, and strange exceptions that suggest a more complicated picture. Let's talk about the gods for a moment. The same gods who were worshipped by warriors, who demanded blood and thunder, also messed with gender and sexual norms like it was a game. Loki, the trickster god. famously shapeshifted into a mare and got impregnated by a stallion, later giving birth to an 8-legged horse. Odin, the All-Father, practiced cedar, a magical art associated with femininity and, by extension, sexual passivity. His enemies mocked him for it, and yet he remained the king of the gods. These myths weren't accidents. They reflect a certain understanding that divine power transcended mortal rules. But mortals, they weren't so lucky. While the gods could bend gender and flirt with taboo, human beings who did the same were often punished, feared, or pushed to the margins. Still, there are tantalizing clues. Some skaldic poetry contains homoerotic subtext, lines that praise the beauty of a young man's body with language that feels intimate. Were these just poetic conventions borrowed from classical sources, or real expressions of desire hidden behind metaphor? Scholars are still arguing, and honestly they always will. Let's add a fringe fact to the pile. There's a single law from medieval Norway that lists penalties for men caught engaging in sword-in, a vague term that probably referred to sexual activity between men. The punishment? Death. But what's interesting is how rarely this law appears. It suggests that either these acts were rare, or they were common and kept deeply secret. And if we've learned anything from history, it's that what gets you killed isn't always what's uncommon, it's what threatens the structure. So what about women? Was female same-sex desire policed as viciously? Strangely, the answer seems to be less so. Female same-sex activity is barely mentioned in the sources, and when it is, it's often framed as curiosity, sorcery, or emotional closeness gone too far. That's not to say women had freedom, just that society wasn't quite sure what to do with the idea. Two women forming a bond outside male control wasn't just erotic, it was destabilizing. But it wasn't as immediately threatening to the masculinity-obsessed social hierarchy. If anything, it was ignored, unless it started causing problems, like one of them refusing to marry or seducing another man's wife. Let's not forget that most of this history was written by men who couldn't imagine female desire existing without a male centre. Which means a lot of same-sex intimacy between women might have flown under the radar, unrecorded, unpunished, and possibly even accepted in the right contexts, especially in religious or healing circles, where women often worked closely together away from men's prying eyes. And that brings us back to the sagas. They're almost silent on this topic. There are a few insults thrown at men, accusations of being womanish, of serving as a mare, or worse. But there's very little narrative space given to same-sex love. No great Viking romance between two men, no tragic tale of star-crossed shieldmaidens. It's a silence that says everything and nothing. So tonight, as you lie in the quiet, imagine the things that never made it into the sagas. The stolen moments, the hidden glances, the bonds that couldn't be named. Not because they weren't real, but because they threatened the myth. And Viking culture? It loved its myths more than it loved its truths. Alright, take a breath because we're about to walk into one of the bleakest and most overlooked corners of Viking society, the lives of thralls. These were the enslaved people of the north, captives, outcasts, the poor born into bondage, and when it came to sex, they had no say, no safety, no protection. So, if you've been imagining Viking farms and households as tight-knit units filled with pride and hearthfire, you're about to see who was really doing the work behind those walls, and who paid the price for the freedom that others enjoyed. Let's start with the basics. A thrall wasn't just a labourer, they were property, bought, sold, inherited, or taken as loot during raids, and while the sagas and legal codes sometimes refer to them vaguely, almost like furniture, they were people, women, men, children. They were taken from Ireland, the Slavic regions, Britain, even as far as North Africa. In fact, the Viking economy thrived in large part because of this human trafficking system. The bustling trade towns of Hedeby, Birka and Kaupang weren't just trading silver and silk, they were trading lives. And here's the ugly truth, thralls were sexually available to their owners. Period. There were no laws against a master sleeping with a female slave. There were no protections for the thrall, no recourse, no consent. It didn't even register as a legal or moral issue, because the woman wasn't considered a full person. She was part of the household inventory. And if she became pregnant? Well, that depended entirely on the mood of the man who owned her. Some masters acknowledged their children by thralls. Some even freed them. Others ignored them, or worse, sold the mother and child separately. In some regions, the child of a thrall automatically inherited slave status, creating a cycle that could go on for generations. And there are hints in both saga and lore that these children, especially if their fathers were high-status men, often grew up in awkward half-worlds, not quite family, not quite livestock. Some rose to prominence, others vanished into oblivion. Now imagine the emotional toll of that. You're a woman taken from your home, stripped of your identity, now living under the roof of someone who can use you however he likes. You cook his meals, nurse his children, clean the waste, and when he wants you in his bed, you go. Not because you want to, but because refusing isn't an option. And the wife? Well, she might despise you, she might punish you. Or she might just pretend you're not there, except when you're needed. Because in Viking society there was no sisterhood between women of unequal status. There was hierarchy and the wife stood above the thrall. And this dynamic was everywhere. In small farms, in trading towns, even in royal households. Some of the most powerful Viking leaders kept thralls, not just for labour, but as symbols of their wealth and reach. A man who owned many slaves wasn't just rich, he was feared. He could raid, conquer, and keep what he took. And the women he took? They didn't even get names in the stories. Let's add a strange little footnote here. The word thrall survives today in modern English, though most people don't realise it. We say we're enthralled when we're captivated, spellbound, unable to look away. But that word comes directly from the Norse term for being a slave. Someone so overpowered, so consumed, that you lose your will. Language has a long memory, and this one stings. Now to be clear, not all thralls were used for sex. Many performed agricultural work, household tasks, or blacksmithing. But the women, especially the young ones, were particularly vulnerable. And while some masters may have thought of these relationships as affectionate or consensual, that illusion falls apart under scrutiny. Can you really consent when the other person owns your body, your labour, your freedom? Still, there were moments, fleeting, quiet, where agency snuck in. A thrall might earn favour. She might be freed after years of loyal service. There are accounts of freed thralls marrying into society, raising legitimate families, even becoming landowners. These stories are rare, but they exist. Like cracks in the ice, they show how nothing in Viking society was entirely rigid. Let's talk about those moments. If a master freed a female thrall and married her, she became a frilla, a kind of second-tier wife or companion. Her children might inherit, depending on local law and the man's standing. But even then, her former status clung to her like smoke. Other women might look down on her. Her new family might resent her. Her children might be challenged in court. Social mobility existed, but it was a razor's edge, and most fell off long before reaching the top. And what about male thralls? They weren't sexually invisible either. While there's less written about it, there's enough to suggest that male slaves could also be exploited, by both men and women. A wealthy woman, frustrated with her marriage or simply asserting her status, might sleep with a male thrall. But here's the catch, she could be punished for it. A free woman having sex with a thrall was considered a major shame to her household. If discovered, then she could face public scorn, a legal action, or even divorce. It wasn't about protecting the thrall, it was about preserving the social order. This double standard tells you everything. A man could sleep with a female slave without consequence. A woman doing the same with a male slave scandal. Because Viking society wasn't just patriarchal, it was obsessed with status, control, and the visual hierarchy of who stood over whom. Let's throw in a fringe fact to cool your blood a bit. In some Viking burials, archaeologists have found thralls buried alongside their masters, sometimes in ways that suggest ritual killing. They weren't given their own graves, they were buried at their owner's feet or in the same pit as if to serve in the afterlife. In a few cases, they were even sacrificed during the funeral rites. That's how little their lives and deaths were valued. No tombstones, no names, just bones tangled in dirt, silent reminders of a system built on flesh. So tonight, as you lie there in comfort, think of the people history tried to forget. The nameless women in shadowed corners, the men who laboured without ever owning their work, the children born in bondage, who might have watched their mothers vanish from one master's house to another without ever saying goodbye. The Viking Age was full of glory, yes, but only if you were standing at the top. If you were at the bottom, you weren't part of the saga. You were the silence between the lines. Alright, you've made it this far. Still awake? Still breathing? Good, because tonight, We shift from bodies as property to bodies as portals, from forced encounters to the one inevitable result of many of those encounters: birth. It's time to talk about Viking motherhood, but let's not pretend this is some peaceful candlelit affair with gentle lullabies and woven cradles. No, childbirth in the Viking Age was raw, dangerous, and often heartbreaking. And the way the Norse handled pregnancy, babies, and the line between life and death reveals more than you might expect about their values, their fears, and their idea of what made a life worth living. Let's start with this chilling truth. Not all babies were welcomed. In fact, some were never meant to survive. The Vikings had a brutal but pragmatic approach to infant life. If a child was born weak, deformed, or simply unwanted, the father had the legal right to expose it, meaning the child could be left outside, usually in the woods or near a stream, to die. No gods required. No guilt, at least not publicly. This wasn't considered murder. It was seen as a grim necessity in a harsh world where survival wasn't guaranteed and resources were finite. A mouth that couldn't eventually feed itself might not be worth feeding at all. This practice wasn't unique to the Vikings, by the way. The ancient Greeks and Romans did it too, but in Norse culture, it carried a cold efficiency. The child wasn't considered fully human until the father accepted it, literally. There was a ritual gesture, lifting the baby off the ground and placing it on the knee, that symbolized acknowledgement. No knee, no name, no future. That's how easily life could be denied. Now imagine being the mother. You've just given birth, probably on the dirt floor of a longhouse, surrounded by female relatives or thralls. No painkillers, no doctors, just herbs, hot water, and the sharp edge of willpower. You're bleeding, you're shaking, and someone, maybe your husband, maybe your father-in-law, is inspecting the newborn and deciding whether it lives or dies. You don't get a vote. Maybe you beg. Maybe you stay silent. Either way, the decision isn't yours. Because even when it was your body that split open, the child is considered part of his bloodline, his legacy, his responsibility, or his burden. If the child is accepted, then the real work begins. Viking motherhood was relentless. Infants were breastfed for as long as possible, up to 2 or 3 years, partly for health, partly because the next pregnancy might not be far behind. Contraception? Not exactly. There's some evidence that women used herbal knowledge to try and space births, things like wild carrot seeds, mugwort, or even copper-based vaginal inserts, but nothing was guaranteed, and repeated pregnancies wore women down fast. By 35, most Viking mothers looked and felt like they'd lived twice that long, and yet children were deeply valued. If they made it past infancy, they were cause for celebration. They were given symbolic gifts, protective charms, and occasionally names that carried the weight of generations. Naming was a sacred act. Some names were chosen to honour ancestors, others to channel the strength of gods or animals. Names weren't just labels, they were destiny, protection, and legacy all rolled into one. Still, Viking childhood was no fairy tale. Half of all the children likely died before the age of 10. Disease, starvation, accidents, raids, you name it. And even for the healthy ones, life came with expectations early. Boys were trained in weapons as soon as they could lift them. Girls learned to weave, milk animals, and manage a household before their first period. Puberty wasn't a milestone, it was a deadline. By 13 or 14 you were already marriage material, and if you were a girl, that usually meant being handed off to another household like a piece of furniture with bloodlines. Now here's where things get weird, because for all their brutality, the Vikings had strong beliefs about fate, spirits, and the soul. A child wasn't just a miniature person, they were a node in the web of weird. Destiny. Some families consulted seeresses, or used divination to predict a child's future. If the omens were bad, well, let's just say exposure wasn't always reserved for physical defects. Sometimes a baby was cast out because it was believed to carry ill luck, or worse, a cursed spirit. That's right, babies could be feared. Imagine being born into a world where the first thing people do is try to sense whether you'll destroy them. Let's toss in a fringe fact. There are traces of what some scholars think were naming feasts, similar to baptisms. These took place 9 nights after birth, if the child had survived. At this event, the baby would be sprinkled with water, named, and officially accepted into the family. This might sound oddly familiar because once Christianity arrived, this ritual morphed into baptism. But even before that, the Norse seemed to understand the symbolic power of marking when a child truly became one of them. And what about miscarriage? Stillbirth? These were spoken of in hushed tones, if at all. A woman who lost a child might be seen as unlucky, possibly cursed, or simply unworthy. Midwives might perform purification rituals or recommend offerings to Freyja or Frigg, the goddesses associated with love and motherhood. But comfort? Therapy? Grief leave? Not in the fjords. You were expected to move on. There were more children to bear, more blood to spill, more heirs to create. And yes, we should talk about fatherhood too, because once a man acknowledged a child, he was responsible for it. That didn't mean he raised it. Most men were gone half the year raiding or trading. But he was expected to protect the family, provide materially, and pass down land, skills, and reputation. Fatherhood was as much about politics as it was about affection. A child was an extension of your legacy. A failed child, a threat to your name. That's why children were sometimes fostered, sent to live with other families to form alliances and teach discipline. Your son might come back with a new accent, a better sword grip, and a new father figure. Here's one last haunting detail. In some rare burials, archaeologists have found the bones of infants buried with female adults, sometimes assumed to be the mother, sometimes not. Some of these tiny graves suggest the child died at or shortly after birth. Others may have been ritual sacrifices. Yes, you heard that right. There's scholarly debate, but a few graves hint that infants were killed to accompany high-status women into the afterlife. Maybe they were children. Maybe they were thralls. Maybe both. Either way, it tells us that birth and death weren't opposite ends of a spectrum. They were often part of the same story. So tonight, as you lie in the dark, think about what it meant to be born into the Viking world, to have your life decided in your first breath, to be carried in arms that were strong, terrified, and scarred, to sleep beside a fire with charms hanging above your head, not to comfort you, but to keep the spirits out, and to grow up knowing that your survival wasn't just luck. It was your first battle, and you had to win it just to be counted. Let's dim the lights a little more, because tonight we're not just talking about pain, we're diving into the pit. The Viking Age, with all its sagas and swords, has been romanticised into oblivion. But underneath the myths and leather-clad fantasies lies something far uglier. The system of sexual slavery that helped keep Viking society running. It wasn't incidental, it wasn't rare. It was baked into the bones of their world, stitched into their raids, and hammered into their economy. So let's stop pretending this was all horned helmets and mead. Tonight, we're looking straight into the cold eyes of a practice so normalised it barely made it into the sagas, because everyone already knew it was happening. Let's start on the sea. You're aboard a longship slicing through the waves toward an English coastal village. You're not just here for silver and livestock. You're here for people, specifically women and girls. You burn the church, kill the men, and take what's left, sometimes young, sometimes not, but always terrified. These captives aren't just loot, they're capital. They're going back with you to be sold, kept, traded, or raped. Likely all of the above. This wasn't the dark side of Viking raids, it was the raid. Once taken, these captives became thralls. If they were young and desirable, they were often given as sexual slaves to the warriors who captured them or sold at market for higher prices. Cities like Dublin, Hedeby, and Birka weren't just trading hubs, they were human markets. The Norse ran one of the most expansive slave networks in early medieval Europe, and sex was a big part of that commerce. Let that settle in for a second. Your favourite Viking hero probably got rich off the forced bodies of others, and for the women, life in captivity was a living death. You weren't a person anymore. You were a vessel, a thing, your language, your gods, your name gone. The man who owned you didn't have to marry you to use you. There were no rituals, no obligations. You might be assigned to his longhouse, made to clean and cook by day and drag to his bed by night. You might bear his child and be forced to nurse it, knowing that it wouldn't even carry your name. Or worse, that it would, and you'd still be nothing but a ghost in its story. Some women were passed around between men, especially among lower status Vikings who couldn't afford to keep a slave of their own. In some cases, captives were used as party favours during feasts or gifted as tokens of alliance. This wasn't always written down in exact terms. The sagas tend to soften these details, but if you read between the lines, it's all there. The woman from across the sea who served the household, the unnamed girl who gave birth and was sent away. No one needed to explain what that meant. They all understood. Now let's talk about scale. This wasn't a one-off horror. Thousands, tens of thousands of people were trafficked at by Viking hands. Some scholars estimate that during peak raiding years, the slave trade was more profitable than silver, and among those trafficked, women were more valuable. Why? Because they could be used and reused. Their labour, their bodies, their ability to produce more slaves through childbirth, it all made them economically essential. That's the cruel logic of slavery. People become tools, and tools that replicate themselves are worth more. There's one particularly dark fragment of Viking poetry that hints at this practice. A warrior boasts that he shared his bed with a captive from Alba, then goes on to say that she sang no songs, but still she wept. It's written almost like a joke, a crude boast, but buried in it is the quiet horror of a woman so broken she doesn't even scream anymore. And in that silence you can hear the full weight of a system built on domination. What about the wives? The respectable women of Viking households? Well, they knew. Everyone did. Some may have looked the other way. Others took it out on the thralls themselves, punishing them, belittling them, reminding them of their place. There are stories of wives cutting the hair of concubines, striking them in public, or forcing them to sleep with animals. And before you get any ideas about women being gentler or more compassionate, remember, in a hierarchical society, those at the top often maintain power by standing on someone else's back. Still, there were exceptions. Rare moments where women formed bonds across this brutal divide. Maybe two women, wife and thrall, sharing whispered grief late at night. Maybe a child clinging to the woman who nursed him, not knowing or caring that she wasn't legitimate. But those moments were fragile, breakable. And they didn't change the system. Let's sprinkle in a chilling fringe fact. The Norse had a term, kvenefang, which literally means taking of women. It's used in some sagas to describe the acquisition of women during raids, as if they were cargo, not human beings. The word's very existence tells you that this wasn't seen as exceptional behaviour. It was expected, institutionalised, spoken of so casually it had its own vocabulary. And then there's the burial evidence. In some graves, especially those of high-status men, we've found the remains of women whose bones tell grim stories. Signs of malnutrition, overwork, trauma. Some buried without jewellery, without markers, often thrown into the earth like afterthoughts. In one particularly gruesome find, a young woman was buried with rope burns on her arms and signs of sexual trauma. No grave goods, no identity, just bones and silence. Scholars debate whether she was a concubine, a sacrifice, or both. You might be wondering, were there ever consequences for this? Any justice, any outcry? Not really. The Norse world accepted sexual slavery as part of its structure. It was never questioned, not in law, not in saga. The only time it became controversial was when it complicated inheritance. If a child born to a thrall became a threat to a legitimate heir, that's when people started talking. Not because of morality, but because of property. So what happened when Christianity came along? You'd think it would have put an end to all this, right? Think again. While Christian moral codes officially condemned slavery and sexual exploitation, they didn't always enforce those rules. In fact, in many areas, the church simply absorbed the system and baptized it, literally. Slaves could be baptized, but still kept. And many Christian Norsemen continued keeping concubines for years after converting, just under different titles. The cross didn't clean everything. So tonight, if your dreams take you to a longhouse, try to listen past the laughter and firelight. Try to hear the footfalls of the invisible, the women no one wrote poems about, the ones who were there night after night at the edge of the bed, waiting for something they never asked for. Their stories didn't make it into the sagas, but they're still part of the truth. And truth, like blood, has a way of seeping through. Let's lift the fog just a little. After the bleak shadows of enslavement and forced silence, tonight's journey brings a flicker of agency, rare, fleeting, and far from perfect, but real nonetheless. Tonight we look at the moments when Viking women ruled the bed, and sometimes the relationship. Because while the Norse world was deeply patriarchal, its women weren't always passive. Some carved out power in places no one expected. Some seduced as tacticians. Some chose their lovers and kept them. And some, in the quiet corners of history, found a way to steer their own stories. So let's begin not with blood or politics, but something more intimate, courtship. Because yes, despite everything we've covered, there was such a thing as mutual attraction in Viking society. Not every relationship was arranged or forced. Not every woman was traded like a sack of grain. Among the free and well-connected, especially in Iceland, there was room, slim but real, for flirtation, rejection and romantic manoeuvring. Imagine a young woman of good standing. Her family is respected, her dowry is solid, and she knows her value. She's not just going to marry the first idiot who walks into the longhouse waving a sword and smelling like salt water. No, she listens, watches, she has the right to reject suitors. And sometimes she does. The sagas are full of women who turn men down, sometimes publicly, with biting wit that would leave any Viking warrior crying into his mead. Take Gudrun Osvifursdottir from the Laxdæla saga. Married 4 times, desired by many, and not afraid to make her own choices, she's one of the most vivid female characters in all of Norse literature. When one of her suitors hesitates to make his move, she basically calls him out for being a coward. Later, she orchestrates a marriage purely to provoke jealousy, and succeeds. She's not just a passive bride. She's playing chess while everyone else is wrestling pigs. Or consider Hallgerda from Njál's saga, a woman whose beauty is matched only by her sharp tongue and strategic mind. She marries more than once and is accused of manipulating her husbands for power. She gets blamed for a lot, and maybe rightfully so, but there's no question she acts with agency. She chooses, she demands, and when she's denied something, like the extra firewood her husband refused me to give her before a battle, she lets him die. Petty, maybe. Iconic, absolutely. Now let's get into the bedroom itself. The sagas don't give us much detail, this isn't medieval erotica, but we do get glimpses. Women seducing men, women refusing men, women manipulating relationships through sex, or withholding it. There's one story where a wife refuses to sleep with her husband until he bathes, which, in Viking terms, is basically revolutionary. She's not being cruel, she's asserting control. He listens, he cleans himself. She gets what she wants. There are also examples of women initiating affairs, some secret, some not. In the saga of the people of Laxdæla, there's a subplot where a woman falls for her sister's husband and lures him into an affair. It's messy, it ends badly. But what's notable is how the narrative doesn't treat her as purely evil. She's misguided, yes, but also human, driven by longing, strategy, and an understanding that sometimes desire is power. Let's drop in a fringe fact here. Viking women sometimes carried small charms or talismans believed to enhance attraction or fertility. Some of these were tied to Freyja, the goddess of love, who was worshipped not as a virginal ideal but as a fully sexual being. Freyja slept with whom she chose. She wept tears of gold for lost lovers. She fought and ruled and rode into battle. For Norse women, she wasn't a symbol of shame or submission. She was a cosmic role model for agency, and agency wasn't just about seduction, it was about survival. A woman who could manipulate affections, hers or others, could gain real power in a household. She might influence inheritance, she might build alliances through her children. She might even whisper in her husband's ear at the thing and shape decisions behind the scenes. In a world where direct female power was limited, the bedroom became a subtle battlefield, and some women were master generals. Of course, this didn't mean risk-free freedom. A woman seen as too sexual, too independent, too cunning could still be shamed. Accusations of witchcraft, infidelity, or dishonour weren't far behind. But the very existence of these accusations tells us something. People were afraid of what women could do when they stepped outside the box. Fear is the shadow of power. Let's not romanticize it too much, though. These women didn't live in a liberated world. They still needed male protection. Their rights were always conditional, and any misstep could lead to exile, scandal, or worse. But within the narrow walls they were given, they sometimes pushed, hard. There's even evidence that some women chose lovers outside of marriage and kept those relationships discreet. In one saga, a woman has a long-term affair with a man she refuses to marry, even after her husband dies. Her reasoning: she likes things as they are, she doesn't want a new master. Her choice isn't praised exactly, but it's respected. She dies on her own terms. Let's shift for a moment to older women. Post-childbearing, post-marriage, post-everything. These women, often widows, sometimes held surprising influence. Without a husband, they could act as heads of households. Some were seen as matriarchs. Others became wise women, matchmakers, or keepers of oral history. Their sexual power may have waned, but their social power often grew. And unlike younger women, they didn't have to flirt or seduce to get it. They had survived. And in Viking culture, survival was its own kind of authority. So tonight, let your thoughts drift to those rare moments when a Viking woman turned the tables. When she looked across the table, or the fire, or the field, and made her choice, not because she was told, but because she wanted to. It might not have been safe, it might not have been lasting, but it was hers. And in a world carved by war and ruled by men, even that, especially that, was an act of quiet rebellion. Tonight, the Longhouse gets a little stranger. You've seen Viking gender roles, how hard the lines were drawn, how fiercely they were enforced. But what about those who didn't fit? What about the ones who blurred the edges, who defied the expectations of what a man or woman should be? In a society where masculinity was law and femininity was duty, where honour clung to your role like frost to wool, what happened when someone didn't or wouldn't perform their assigned part? Tonight, we're stepping into the realm of cross-dressing, gender-bending, and the sacred chaos that sometimes slipped through the cracks of Viking conformity. It didn't happen often, and when it did, it usually wasn't safe. But it did happen, and not always in the shadows. Let's start with one of the most baffling and intriguing features of Old Norse religion. The gods themselves didn't always follow the rules. Odin, the All-Father, was the epitome of masculine power, wise, battle-hardened, one-eyed, the master of ravens and runes. But Odin also practiced cedar, a magical craft associated with women. He dressed in women's clothing to perform rituals. He chanted like a vulva, taking on the role of a female sorceress. His enemies mocked him for it, calling him Arga, unmanly, shameful. And yet, he was still Odin. Still the most powerful being in the cosmos. So what gives? Well, Norse mythology is full of contradictions. The gods weren't bound by human norms. They could shapeshift, seduce, and swap roles at will. Loki, for example, didn't just change clothes, he changed species. He turned into a mare, got impregnated by a stallion, and gave birth to Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse. Later he disguised himself as a woman to infiltrate a feast, seduced men, and committed acts that would have gotten a mortal exiled. The stories laugh at his antics, but they also marvel at his power. These myths reflect something deeper, an understanding that magic, transformations, and dim desire existed outside human order. And when mortals tried to tap into that energy, well, things got complicated. Enter the real-world figure of the Volva. This was a female seer, a practitioner of Saida, and often a social outlier. She wore elaborate clothing, sometimes men's cloaks or symbolic garments, and carried staffs shaped like wands or spears. Her role was both feared and respected. She could see the future, speak to spirits, curse or bless. People invited her into their homes during times of crisis, but she never quite belonged. She didn't spin or cook or raise children. She existed on the edge of the village, in power but never in comfort. Now, every once in a while, a man took on this role. He wore the robes, performed the rituals, chanted the songs, and when he did, he risked being labelled ergi, the dreaded word that implied sexual deviance, gender inversion and dishonour. Practicing cedar as a man wasn't just unmanly, it was dangerous. Not because the magic didn't work, but because it did. People feared what a gender non-conforming sorcerer might be able to do. Fear in Viking culture often came wrapped in ridicule, which meant mockery wasn't just cruelty, it was a form of defence. Let's explore a fringe but fascinating angle: ritual performance. Some scholars believe certain Norse ceremonies may have involved gender-fluid roles. During seasonal festivals or cultic rites, participants might cross-dress, swap symbols, or act out mythic stories involving transformation. This wasn't drag in the modern sense, it was sacred theatre, designed to connect the human world with the divine chaos of the gods. And sometimes men became women and women became something else entirely. Did this mean people accepted gender non-conformity? Not exactly. Outside the ritual space, it was a different story. Viking law codes had strict views on how men and women should dress. In some regions, a man caught wearing female clothing could be fined, shamed, or exiled. Not because clothing itself was dangerous, but because it represented identity. And identity in this world was everything. If a man acted like a woman, what else might he do? Submit, weep, lose control? The fear was never just about appearance, it was about the collapse of order. And yet people still crossed those lines. Some of them may have done so for love, for survival, or simply because it was who they were. Their stories didn't make it into the sagas, or if they did, they were edited into jokes, cautionary tales, or outright erasure. But here's the thing about silence. It doesn't mean absence. It means someone was afraid to speak. Take, for example, the occasional references in poetry to effeminate men. These insults, often hurled in moments of rage, accuse men not just of sexual passivity but of dressing improperly, behaving delicately, or avoiding violence. The fact that such insults were so potent tells us something important. They weren't thrown at imaginary people. They were hurled at real men who existed and scared the status quo. And on the flip side, women who dressed like men weren't always condemned. In the sagas, we hear of shieldmaidens who wore male clothing, fought with swords, and refused marriage. These figures were often treated with awe, not disgust. They were rare, yes, and always tinged with tragedy. But they were respected. Why? Because they acted like men. They fought, they killed, they asserted dominance. In other words, they adopted power. Viking society, it turns out, wasn't afraid of women behaving like men. It was afraid of men behaving like women. Let's talk about funerary evidence. A grave in Sweden, long assumed to be male because of the weapons buried with it, was later revealed through DNA testing to be female. Cue scholarly debate. Was she a warrior? A woman dressed as a man? Or someone who lived outside gender categories entirely? We don't know. But what we do know is that Viking burial practices sometimes made space for ambiguity. Sometimes the grave goods don't match the biology. Sometimes they challenge it. And what about love? What about desire? The Norse didn't have words for trans, but they had concepts of transformation, fluidity, and role reversal baked into their mythology. It's not a stretch to imagine that some people felt more aligned with roles outside their assigned gender. Did they have relationships? Did they find community? We'll probably never know, but their echoes, quiet, uneasy, often erased, still hum beneath the surface of Viking history. So tonight, let yourself drift into that liminal space. The crack in the saga where the light flickers, where someone stands between worlds. Not man, not woman. Something else. Something older. Something the gods might have recognized, even if the villagers did not. And in a world obsessed with strength and order, maybe that kind of fluidity was the most dangerous and sacred thing of all. Tonight, we step into the longhouse. No, really. Close your eyes and imagine it. Low ceiling, smoky air, thick with the scent of wood smoke. Sweat and maybe some roasted meat if you're lucky. It's crowded. You hear the crackle of fire, the murmur of voices, the wet slap of someone chopping fish in the corner. Privacy? Forget it. Everyone hears everything. Everyone smells everything. And yet, this is where most Viking lives played out. Not just eating, not just sleeping, but loving, fighting, birthing, grieving. Even sex, when it happened right here, just behind a curtain? Maybe. So tonight we're talking about domestic intimacy, or whatever passed for it in a world where 10 people shared one room, and the goat sometimes slept inside during winter. The longhouse wasn't just home, it was a theatre of power, survival, and relationship dynamics you could cut with a dull knife. Start by picturing the layout. Viking longhouses were long, low buildings, made of turf, timber, and thatch. Think of a giant loaf of bread with a fire running down the middle, and platforms along the sides. These raised platforms served as seating during the day and beds at night. You slept next to your family, your in-laws, your servants, your thralls, and sometimes your livestock. The idea of a private bedroom? That was for kings, and even then probably not much better. And yet this space, tight, loud, communal, was the backdrop for most Viking relationships. Courtship, marriage, affairs, domestic disputes, childbirth, death, all of it played out with an audience. You might try to steal a moment in a hayloft or behind a tapestry, but chances are someone was snoring 10 feet away. That meant intimacy had to adapt. Sex wasn't a candlelit performance. It was more like a negotiation of timing, opportunity, and willpower. How did people make it work? Well, sometimes they didn't. Marriages could go sexless for months if the couple had no privacy, or if they didn't particularly like each other. And that wasn't even considered weird. Marriage was about economics, not affection. If a couple was affectionate, great. If they weren't, just another day in the longhouse. But physical needs didn't disappear, and neither did desire. Which is why you occasionally find stories of affairs with servants, cousins, even travelling guests. Not always for love, sometimes just for a sliver of space, of secrecy, of autonomy. And when sex did happen, it wasn't necessarily whispered or hidden. In some households, the entire family might simply turn away, roll over, or pretend to be asleep. There are even suggestions in saga literature that couples were expected to be discreet but not synced. In one saga, a man is embarrassed because people overheard him being, let's say, too enthusiastic. It wasn't the sex itself that was shameful, it was the lack of control. That's the key idea here. Control. Viking society was obsessed with it. You could be loud at the feast, brutal on the battlefield, cruel in court, but in matters of intimacy, you were expected to be composed, stoic, even during sex, because if you weren't, if you lost control of your body or emotions, people might start asking questions about your maneskia, your character. That word literally means personhood, but it also implies honour, social standing and self-possession. Now let's get into a fringe fact. Some Viking homes had partitioned sections called skot, little alcoves or enclosures that could serve as storage or sleeping areas. These weren't exactly soundproof, but they offered a shred of separation. A couple might claim one if they were high status or newly married. Think of it as the honeymoon suite, if your honeymoon suite came with a neighbour butchering a pig 10 feet away. But what's really fascinating is how the longhouse functioned as a stage for social drama. Disputes between spouses happened in full view. If a wife denied her husband sex, everyone noticed. If a husband favoured a thrall or concubine too openly, people whispered. Children watched, servants remembered. The walls of the longhouse were made of turf, not secrets. This exposure also gave rise to ritualized forms of conflict. A wife might insult her husband in front of others to shame him. A husband might embarrass his wife with a joke or jab. These weren't just petty spats, they were power plays. In a society without therapists or private interventions, public tension was a form of communication. It let people release pressure without outright rebellion. And yes, love could bloom here too. There are rare, sweet moments in the sagas where affection pierces through the smoke. A husband placing his arm around his wife at a feast. A wife quietly grieving when her husband is slain. Even a man bragging about how his wife keeps him warm in winter. Not a metaphor, just actual warmth, which in this climate meant more than poetry. Still, tenderness had to be subtle. Excessive emotion was frowned upon. To love too much was to risk dishonour, vulnerability, loss. Men weren't supposed to be too affectionate. Women weren't supposed to be too independent. But of course, humans are messy. Which is why, buried under the Stoic saga lines, you can feel the tremble of real relationships, desire, frustration, comfort, betrayal. The longhouse held them all like embers under ash. Let's not forget the children. They saw everything. They grew up watching their parents argue, flirt, fight, make up, or drift apart. There were no bedtime filters. A child might fall asleep to the sound of laughter, or to the muffled tension of parents avoiding each other for weeks. The home was a school, and what it taught was that survival came before affection. But affection, that was still there in the quiet moments, a shared meal, a hand resting on a shoulder. Here's a quirky little detail. Some Viking families used runes to mark personal spaces or objects. A comb might be carved with a lover's initials. A cup might have a romantic inscription, tucked under the rim where only one person would notice. These small gestures, a private rune in a public world, remind us that even in a culture of iron and ice, people still craved softness. So tonight, as the longhouse flickers to life in your mind, imagine the hearth burning low. A couple nestled together under furs, backs turned to the room, bodies curled in sync. Maybe it's love. Maybe it's just habit. Maybe it's the only way to stay warm. But in this oily, crowded, smoke-filled space, even the smallest intimacy is an act of resistance. Because sometimes the quietest places hold the fiercest truths. Let's stay right here in the longhouse a little longer. But now we're shifting focus, not to couples or women or power plays, but to you, or rather to the body you inhabit. Because in the Viking Age, the body wasn't just something you lived in. It was your resume, your status badge, your sacred vessel, and your battlefield, all rolled into one. And when it came to sex and gender, the body didn't just matter. It was everything. Tonight, we explore how the Vikings saw the human form, not as a blank canvas, but as a coded message, written in skin, scars, hair, and movement. You couldn't escape it. You were it. Let's start with the male body, because, surprise, surprise, that's where Viking society put most of its attention. The ideal Viking man wasn't just strong, he was controlled. Not just muscular, composed. Muscles meant nothing if you couldn't use them in the right way, at the right time, with the right amount of stoic flair. You were expected to be a beast in battle, but a statue at home. Your body had to be weaponized, but never out of control. Too much lust, too much weeping, too much emotion. That was weakness, or worse, feminine. And masculinity wasn't only physical, it was performative. You had to carry yourself like someone who couldn't be conquered. That meant how you walked, how you sat, how you held your drink. There were unwritten rules. Don't bend over too low. Don't speak too softly. Don't show too much joy or too much grief. The body was a theatre, and every movement was being judged. But the real pressure came when your masculinity was challenged. Remember that terrifying Norse word we keep running into? Ergi. It didn't just apply to sex. A man who was too smooth, too quiet, too pretty, might also be accused of unmanliness. And since most people couldn't read or write, your body was your reputation. If you didn't look the part, people filled in the blanks. Let's drop in a fascinating fringe fact. Viking men were known to be extremely vain about their appearance. Don't let the battle-worn aesthetic fool you. These guys were grooming hard. Weekly baths, combs hanging from their belts, tweezers, ear spoons, even razors. Some foreign monks were scandalized by how clean and well-kempt the Norse were. They accused them of seducing Christian women with their hygiene, and they weren't wrong. Being well-groomed wasn't just vanity, it was a mating strategy. But here's where it gets interesting. The body could also betray you. If you became ill, deformed, or injured in a way that made you less manly, your entire identity might suffer. There's one saga in which a warrior loses his nose and is forever mocked, even though he continues to fight. Why? Because the wound ruined his face, and a face was part of the performance. Honour didn't care about what you could endure. It cared about how you looked enduring it. Now, shift to the female body. The expectations were different, but no less intense. A Viking woman's body was a site of production. Children, food, textiles. Her worth was often measured in fertility, in curves, in strength, but also in restraint. Too seductive? You were trouble. Too plain? You were worthless. You were expected to carry weight, literally and metaphorically, while making it all look effortless. And if something went wrong with your body, infertility, illness, injury, your value in the marriage market could plummet. Breasts, hips, skin and hair were all signals loaded with social meaning. Blonde hair, for example, was considered beautiful and rare in some parts of Scandinavia, so people bleached their hair with lysop despite the damage it caused. Not for beauty's sake alone, but because blonde hair made you look youthful, high status and vaguely god-touched. Think Freyja or Sif, whose golden hair was literally made by dwarves after Loki cut it off. You weren't just a woman, you were expected to resemble a goddess. No pressure. Now let's talk about tattoos. There's limited evidence for them in the Viking world, mainly from Arabic accounts describing Norsemen covered in dark green symbols. Some scholars believe these were tattoos, possibly runes or protective marks. Others think they were body paint. Either way, the body was a canvas for identity. Some symbols may have been spiritual, others ornamental, but in a world where paper was rare and literacy even rarer, your body told your story, literally inked into your skin. Then there's jewellery. Viking men and women wore it, not just for decoration, but as portable wealth and status. A brooch wasn't just shiny. It told people what region you were from, what class you belonged to, and whether you were married. Bracelets could indicate alliances, rings might carry secret runes, and piercings, not confirmed, but not out of the question. If you were rich, your body glittered. If you were poor, you still tried, but sometimes the body refused to cooperate. Disease, injury, aging, all of it threatened your place in the social order. There are saga tales of men hiding their wounds, women disguising pregnancies, elderly warriors refusing to limp even when their knees gave out. You couldn't afford to show weakness, because weakness invited insult, and insult invited challenge, and challenges, they ended in blood. Here's a scholarly debate for you. Did the Vikings have a concept of ideal beauty? Some argue yes, that they preferred symmetrical faces, tall builds, and certain hair colours. Others argue that beauty was situational, based on health, wealth, and behaviour more than features. A woman might not be beautiful, but if she was clever and composed, she was desirable. A man might be ugly, but if he was rich and ruthless, he was a catch. The sagas don't always praise looks, they often praise presence. that indefinable quality of commanding a room with or without the jawline. Still, the pressure was real, and not just for adults. Children too were judged. A weak-looking child might be exposed. A strong one might be marked early for greatness. Bodies were measured, praised, feared, and judged from the moment they entered the world. And gender, that too was worn on the body. Clothing, posture, hair length, everything had to align. Cross those lines and people noticed. They might laugh, they might attack, or they might just whisper. But either way, the body was always the first thing judged, the last thing forgiven. So tonight, as you lie there in your own body, think about what it would mean to live in a world where your worth, your role, even your soul was measured by the way you moved, the shape of your jaw, the sound of your footsteps. No privacy, no rebranding, just flesh and bone on full display. Every hour of every day, because in the Viking Age you didn't have a body, you were your body, and the world never stopped looking. Tonight we take a turn toward the sacred and the unsettling. So far we've sifted through the bones of daily life, the grit of bodies, the hunger, the cruelty, the twisted forms of love. But what about the divine? What did the Vikings believe about sex and the gods? Was it dirty? Holy? A weapon? A gift? The answer, as usual, is all of the above. Because in Norse mythology, sex wasn't tucked into corners. It was everywhere, braided into the fabric of the cosmos, echoing through the gods' laughter, their rage, and sometimes their shame. So tonight, let's whisper through the old stories and try to hear what they're really saying. Fair warning, this isn't your average Sunday school mythology. The Norse gods were messy, petty, lustful, vengeful. They didn't teach purity. They didn't demand chastity. In fact, if there was any divine rule about sex, it was this: power and pleasure are dangerous but irresistible. Let's start with the obvious figure, Freyja, goddess of love, beauty, fertility and war. She's the one Viking women whispered to when they wanted children, or lovers, or both. She wept tears of gold for her lost husband, Odin. She flew through the sky in a chariot pulled by cats. She wore a necklace so beautiful, Brisingamen, that she allegedly slept with 4 dwarves to obtain it. That's not an insult, that's the myth. Freyja's sexuality wasn't a flaw, it was her power. But that didn't stop others from using it against her. In the Loki, Loki publicly accuses her of sleeping with her own brother, with every god in Asgard, with a long list of mortals and even some she probably didn't know existed. And Freyja? She doesn't deny it. She just gets furious and curses him back. Because in Viking myth, being sexually active didn't make you weak, being ashamed of it. That was the real insult. But Freyja wasn't alone in this divine mess. Her brother, Freyr, god of fertility and agriculture, had a literal erection so legendary it inspired the design of ceremonial statues. Yep. Some early Norse fertility idols were, to put it plainly, very well endowed. Freyja once fell in love with a giantess just by watching her walk. Didn't speak to her, didn't court her, just saw her and decided, that's the one, and then gave away his magic sword to win her, which of course leads to future disaster. Let that be a lesson. Don't trade your weapon for a date. But the gods didn't just have sex, they used it as currency, as punishment, as transformation. Take Loki, everyone's favourite shapeshifter, liar and chaos magnet. He's had sex as a man, as a woman, as a horse, and possibly as a fish, though that one's more metaphorical. Loki's entire mythos is built on crossing boundaries, gender, form and morality, and his sexuality is never stable. He seduces, deceives, gives birth, then mocks others for their sexual behaviour. In one tale he turns into a mare, gets mounted by a stallion, and later gives birth to an 8-legged horse. The story's played for laughs, but it sits uncomfortably in the mythic landscape, a god sexually penetrated giving birth, and then still standing shoulder to shoulder with the rest of the divine pantheon. It's subversion wrapped in comedy. And then there's Odin, king of the gods, father of many, but also practitioner of Seda, the feminine form of magic we talked about earlier. Odin learned this craft from Freyja, which meant he had to adopt female-associated behaviours, sometimes including cross-dressing. For this, he was ridiculed by other gods and mortals alike. But did he care? No, because Odin valued knowledge and power more than honour, which, in the Viking world, made him both admirable and terrifying. He broke the rules, but only because he could afford to. So what does all this tell us? That the divine landscape mirrored the human one, but with more fluidity, more strangeness, more freedom. The gods acted out all the messy contradictions that human society tried to suppress. They were horny, petty, unfaithful, and violent. They betrayed each other, seduced each other, mocked each other. But unlike humans, they didn't suffer the same consequences. A mortal man caught sleeping with someone's wife might be killed. But Thor? He just laughs it off and throws a hammer. Here's a fringe fact for you. Some Viking Age temples, or hofs, included carved depictions of genitalia. Not hidden, not shamed. Celebrated. Fertility wasn't a metaphor, it was sacred. Priests and priestesses might have engaged in ritual sex or fertility rites, especially during seasonal festivals. There's no hard proof, no pun intended. But oral tradition and comparative archaeology suggest that sex was sometimes part of how people connected with the divine. There's also debate over sacred prostitution, a practice found in other ancient cultures where sex with temple workers was considered a blessing or offering. Did it happen in Norse culture? We don't know for sure. Some scholars say no, arguing there's no textual evidence. Others point to mythic patterns and fertility symbols and say, maybe, just maybe it did in some form we can't quite reconstruct. But even if temple sex wasn't common, the connection between sexuality and the sacred was unmistakable. Fertility, love, magic, all were entwined. A woman who could seduce might also be a healer. A man who dreamed of erotic visions might be receiving messages from the gods. Desire wasn't just animal, it was cosmic. And yet the gods were still used to reinforce human power structures. Loki's insults in the Lokasenna aren't just gossip. They're an attack on status, a reminder that even gods can be shamed for how they use their bodies. Freyja is slut-shamed. Odin is mocked for femininity. Thor is teased for dressing as a bride to retrieve his hammer. These stories don't just entertain, they warn. They warn mortals that sex is dangerous, powerful, transformative, and when wielded wrong, or merely perceived as wrong, it can unmake even the highest among you. So tonight, think of those old gods, laughing, lusting, lying, crying. Think of Freyja, furious and golden. Think of Loki, birthing monsters and jokes. Think of Odin, cloaked in woman's robes, whispering secrets to the dead. In their stories, you find something ancient and uneasy, that desire is not shameful, but it is unruly. And in the Viking world, what you couldn't control was often what scared you most. Tonight, we step away from the divine drama and back into the dirt, into the lived human space where law met desire, where boundaries were tested, and where the most dangerous thing you could do wasn't lie or steal, but touch the wrong person at the wrong time. In this section, we explore how the Vikings policed sex through law, shame, violence, and sometimes terrifying precision. Because if you think medieval Scandinavia was some free-love pagan paradise, but you haven't read their court cases, start by imagining the Thing, the Viking legal assembly. It's not a courtroom, it's more like an open-air parliament held in a field, usually near a sacred site, where disputes are shouted, judged, and resolved by consensus, or swords. You don't walk into the Thing lightly. People bring cases about land, inheritance, murder, and yes, sexual misconduct. And when those cases come up, it's not just about guilt or innocence. It's about honour. Yours, your family's, your children's. If your name is stained, your life might as well be over, even if you're found technically not guilty. The Norse legal system didn't have prisons. Punishments were economic, fines, social, shunning, or violent, execution or outlawry. And when it came to sex, the line between justice and vengeance was razor thin. Let's talk adultery. If a man caught another man sleeping with his wife, he had several options, none of them kind. He could kill the offender on the spot, and under many regional laws, it would be considered justified. Honour defended, no crime committed. But, and this is important, it wasn't always about violence. Sometimes men sought revenge by taking the case to the Thing and demanding compensation, a public shaming, a financial penalty, or, in really petty moments, by sleeping with the offender's wife in return, eye for an eye, wife for a wife. And if you were a woman accused of adultery, good luck. The law wasn't kind. In some areas, you could be divorced immediately, stripped of your dowry, and sent back to your family in disgrace. Worse, if your husband accused you of infidelity and had witnesses, and yes, they often demanded witnesses for the act itself, you might be judged as unfaithful even if the accusation came from spite. In extreme cases, the punishment could be death, especially if the betrayal caused a political rift between families. Here's a disturbing wrinkle. The law often distinguished between rape and seduction not based on the woman's testimony, but on whether a complaint was made by her male relatives. That's right. If a woman was assaulted but her father or husband didn't speak up, it might not even be considered a crime. But if a free woman willingly slept with someone outside of marriage and her family objected, that was a crime, against the family's honour. The logic? Her body wasn't just hers, it was their property. Now let's throw in a fringe fact that really puts the chill in your bones. Norse law included specific fines for rape if the woman was of free status. If she was a thrall, the penalty was far less, or non-existent. Sometimes it wasn't even seen as a violation of her, but as damage to her owner's property. This wasn't about consent, it was about class. A noblewoman's assault might cause a feud. A slave woman's assault might not even make the gossip rounds. And then there were the public insults. If someone accused you of being arg or unmanly, perverted, passive, you had the legal right to demand a duel. Because the accusation was seen as more than slander. It was a direct attack on your personhood. An insult like, he was a bottom, or he serves as a mare, could cost someone their life. Not because of the act itself, but because of what it implied about your social position. Women too were targets of verbal warfare. Calling a woman flugandi hora, a flying whore, could start a blood feud. If a man accused a woman of sleeping with someone outside her marriage, or worse, outside her class, her husband or brothers might challenge him to a fight. But sometimes, the woman herself retaliated with curses, threats, or, in the case of a few legendary sagas, a knife. The point is, sex wasn't just private business. It was a social currency, a weapon, and a liability all at once. You had to be careful who you touched, who you looked at, even who you joked about. And the law didn't just deal with acts, it tried to control behaviour. There were laws about where men and women could bathe to prevent temptation, laws about betrothals and dowries which acted like contracts. If you broke an engagement by sleeping with someone else, that could be grounds for legal action. Not just heartbreak, compensation. There's even debate among scholars about whether some Viking communities used physical punishments for sexual deviance. One Icelandic law code hints at mutilation for certain offences, castration, nose cutting, or branding. It's not clear how often these were enforced, but the threat was there, and when exile, outlawry, was used as punishment, it was often a death sentence by other means. You were cast out of society, unprotected by law. Anyone could kill you, and no one would be punished for it. But Viking law also had moments of strange leniency. Some regions allowed divorce initiated by women, rare in the medieval world. If a husband mistreated his wife, failed to support her, or made her a public embarrassment, she could walk, with her property. Sometimes the legal system worked in her favour, especially in Iceland, where families wielded more power than kings. A clever woman could use the law like a dagger. One more quirky fact, some sagas describe sex-related crimes being settled not with violence, but with poetry. That's right. In some cases, a man could challenge another to a contest of insults. Flighting. If he won, his honour was restored. If he lost, well, he might still have to pay, but at least he got in a few good lines. The idea that words could settle wounds is deeply Viking. Brutal, yes, but poetic, always. So tonight, as the wind presses against your windows, think about a world where every kiss could lead to a duel. Where the law listened, but only if the right person spoke. Where a moment of pleasure might cost you your name, your land, or your life. Because in the Viking world, sex wasn't just about bodies. It was about honour. And honour, once cracked, was almost impossible to repair. Tonight the longhouse goes quiet, not with sleep, but with grief. Because for all the lust and laughter, the power plays and scandal, there was one reality that cut through every life in the Viking Age: death. And when it came, it didn't care if you were a chieftain or a thrall, married or unmarried, lover or loner. But what's more fascinating, what pulls us deeper into their world, is how they responded to it. Especially when it came to those intimate ties, to the wives, concubines, lovers, and sometimes even the unwilling, who followed the dead into the dirt or fire or sea. Tonight we talk about death and sex, not as opposites, but as twisted twins, always circling each other in Viking cosmology, because to the Norse life was a thread-spun, measured, and cut by the Norns, And if you happen to be entangled with someone when that thread snapped, well, you might just get pulled along. Let's begin with funerals. Viking burials weren't one-fits-all. A high-status individual might get a ship burial laid out with weapons, jewellery, food, tools, animals, and sometimes people. Yes, people. There are graves, unearthed from Norway to Ukraine, where one individual is buried at the centre, with others placed around them. Some clearly dead of natural causes, others not so much. Take the famous Oseberg ship burial. 2 women, one older, one younger, decked out with stunning riches, carved sledges, textile tools, animals, even a cart. Scholars still debate who they were, priestesses, queens, lovers, family. One was clearly high status. The other maybe a servant, or maybe someone more intimate. But here's where it gets eerie. The body of the younger woman shows signs of trauma. Possibly illness, possibly something else. Was she sacrificed? Did she volunteer? No one knows for sure, but we do know this: ritual death was part of the Viking worldview, especially when the deceased was powerful, and if they had wives, slaves or lovers, those people might be expected to follow them into the next world, sometimes willingly, sometimes not. The most chilling account we have comes from an Arab traveller, Ahmed ibn Fadlan al-Minin, who witnessed the funeral of a Rus chieftain along the Volga River. These were Norsemen, culturally Viking, living in what's now Russia. He describes a slave girl, possibly a concubine, who volunteers to be sacrificed. She's given heavy amounts of alcohol, paraded through the camp, then subjected to what he calls ritual sex by several men. Not lovingly, not symbolically, just methodically. And then, finally, she's killed. Stabbed, strangled, laid beside the dead man in his ship before it's set ablaze. It's one of the most graphic, disturbing depictions of a Viking funeral. And while scholars debate how typical it was, the practice of following the dead isn't just legend, it was real, documented, and deeply tied to the idea that the dead needed companions, that status in the afterlife should mirror status in life. If you were a powerful man, of course you should enter Valhalla with women at your side, even if they had no say in it. Now, let's pull back from the horror for a moment. Not all Viking burials were violent. Many were quiet affairs. Cremations, graves lined with stone, simple grave goods. But even these held echoes of relationships. A woman buried with a man's sword might have been his wife, or his daughter, or his lover. A man buried with weaving tools, possibly someone who lived outside conventional male roles, possibly someone whose identity wasn't simple, because the grave doesn't lie. But it also doesn't explain. Here's a fringe fact. Archaeologists sometimes find double burials, 2 people, male and female, laid side by side with matching jewellery or mirrored grave goods. Romantic? Maybe, or maybe symbolic. Maybe the man died and the woman was buried later. Or maybe they died together. We can't ask, but we can imagine, and we do. Now let's talk about mourning too. The Vikings didn't bottle up their grief. They screamed it into the wind. Women in particular were expected to perform mourning, tearing their clothes, cutting their hair, even wailing loudly at the funeral pyre. It was theatrical, raw, and absolutely necessary. Silence wasn't stoic. It was suspicious. If you didn't mourn loudly, people might assume you had something to gain. But mourning wasn't just sadness, it was duty. A widow might be expected to guard her husband's legacy, raise his children, protect his property, or she might be married off again within weeks, especially if her womb was still useful. No one had the luxury of permanent grief. Life moved fast, winters were long, fields needed tending. So the line between love and obligation blurred quickly. And if a woman wasn't married when her partner died, well, things got complicated. Concubines had no legal claim to property. A mistress might be thrown out even if she bore the man's child. Her grief didn't count. Her body didn't count. She was collateral. Even if the man whispered promises, even if she shared his bed for years. The law didn't recognise her, and neither did his family. Still, not all endings were cruel. Some saga stories describe women choosing to join their lovers in death, not by force but by belief, that they'd meet again, that love, however messy or unequal, transcended this world. The sagas are sparse with sentiment, but when they give us grief it hits hard. A wife carving runes into her husband's grave marker, a lover singing to the sea after her man's body is lost in a storm, a mother burying her child and walking home alone, because sex and love in Viking society didn't come with guarantees. But death came for everyone. Let's drift now to one final image. A stone grave on a lonely hill, wind in the grass, bones beneath. A brooch, rusted, a comb, a ring, 2 bodies maybe, once warm, once tangled, now dust. We don't know their names, but someone did. Someone lit that fire. Someone whispered something as the earth closed over them. Because even in a world so harsh, so structured, so brutally unfair, someone still believed that love should follow you into the next life. Even if you never had the chance to choose it in this one. Tonight, we wade into what's perhaps the murkiest water of all, the moments when the lines between ritual, myth, and trauma blur beyond recognition. We've talked about sex in the Viking world as power, as punishment, as survival, and sometimes as love. But in this section, we're taking a hard look at ritualized sexuality, the kind that shows up half buried in saga whispers, carved into stone, or passed down in songs no one sings out loud anymore. Because for the Vikings, sex wasn't just something that happened in the dark. It was sometimes dragged into the light, made public, made performance and meanhands. Made shid, or terrifying. Let's begin with what's known as ritual drama. Now this isn't the kind of drama you're thinking of. There were no stages, no curtains. Instead, these were symbolic reenactments of myths, of seasonal cycles, of fertility and death. They happened during blots, sacrificial feasts to the gods where people gathered to offer animals, and rarely humans, in return for good harvests, safe journeys, or victory in war. And while most of these rituals involved drinking, chanting, and offering blood, some may have involved another kind of offering, sex. Now don't get ahead of yourself. This wasn't some free-for-all orgy under the midnight sun, but there are fragmented references, both archaeological and folkloric, that suggest sexual acts may have been symbolically performed to honour fertility deities like Freyr and Freyja. These could have been private unions sanctified by the gods, or public performances designed to mirror divine myths. For example, the sacred union of a king and priestess, or symbolic bride, representing Freyja and the land itself, ensuring the fertility of crops and people alike. The line between consent and obligation in these rituals? Not always clear. Some scholars argue that participants were willing, spiritually devoted, perhaps even revered. Others suspect coercion, hierarchy, and the crushing weight of religious expectation. A priestess selected to marry a local chieftain in a fertility rite may have had no real power to refuse. A male chosen to embody Freyja might not be allowed to walk away once the drum started. Let's add a fringe fact here. In one old Norse poem, there's a passage that may reference the binding of loins during a midwinter festival. It's cryptic, metaphorical, and hotly debated. Some interpret it as a symbolic phrase for the bond of kinship. Others believe it refers to ritualized intercourse. The poem itself is full of double meanings, typical of Norse verse, but it's enough to make you wonder just how sacred the body could become when draped in myth. And here's where things start to crack, because not all ritualized sex was celebratory. Some appears to have been punitive, especially for outsiders, captives, or slaves. In certain revenge sagas, men are forced to perform degrading acts meant to emasculate, humiliate, and strip them of honour. These aren't just sexual assaults, they're public performances of power, done to someone as a statement to everyone. For example, in Grettir's saga, a man is accused of performing Seda and is subsequently mocked with sexual insults that suggest penetration, softness, and female behaviour. No act is described explicitly, but the consequences are brutal: social ruin, exile, and death. In Viking culture, to be seen as sexually passive, especially as a man, was to be marked, not just with shame, but with ritual uncleanliness. You were uncut from society, stripped of the protections that made you human. Now contrast that with the vulvas, the female seeresses. They too performed ritual acts. Their staff was a symbol of magical power, but it was also deeply phallic. Some ceremonies involved rhythmic chanting, ecstatic movement, trance states, and possibly symbolic sexual gestures. These weren't orgies, they were spiritual performances, but again, the boundary between symbol and flesh may have been dangerously thin. Some accounts suggest these women, often older and unmarried, wielded both awe and fear. They didn't need men to protect them, they needed no family to define them. Their sexuality, dormant or active, became part of their power, and in a society built on gender hierarchy, that made them deeply threatening. Let's talk about the dark side now, ritual sacrifice. As we touched on earlier, there are graves where individuals, often young women, appear to have been killed during or after significant ritual events. Some were buried with warriors, others with chieftains. In one haunting case from Denmark, a woman's body was found in a bog, naked, with her arms bound, hair neatly combed and strangled with a garrote. No injuries, no signs of resistance, just placed, preserved. What does this have to do with sex? Everything and nothing. The body becomes a symbol, female, clean, quiet, possibly virgin, possibly not. Sacrificed not for who she was, but for what she represented. Fertility, submission, renewal. It's not unlike what happened in myth, where gods often demanded beautiful youths as tribute. You can feel the echo of that logic in these bones. Scholars still argue, were these women victims or volunteers? Were they priestesses offering themselves to the gods? Or captives dressed up to look like martyrs? Were these acts of devotional control? The truth is we don't know, and that's what makes it worse, because silence, especially the ritual kind, tends to favour those with power. Here's a surprising angle. Some rituals involved verbal sex. Don't laugh. This was serious. Insult poetry was so powerful, so legally dangerous that composing a verse accusing someone of sexual shame could get you killed. The words themselves were a kind of ritual act. If you accused a man of being passive during sex, that was violence. If you accused a woman of being too dominant, that was slander. And if you spoke it in front of witnesses, that was war. So in this world, sex could be vorid, or a sword, a blessing, or a curse. It could be offered to the gods as a plea, or forced upon a captive as punishment. It could be symbol and substance, metaphor and memory. But it was never neutral. Not in ritual, not in myth, not in life. So tonight, picture a torchlit clearing. Snow falling, a circle of people chanting, a woman stepping forward with paint on her face and a staff in her hand. She isn't smiling, she isn't afraid. She looks out at the crowd, eyes like ice, and begins to speak. Not in words you know, but in a rhythm older than language. And somewhere in that moment the divide between body and symbol collapses. Because in the Viking world, sex wasn't just something you did, it was something you became. Tonight we reach the edge. The last circle of the Longhouse fire. The final whisper before the coals go cold. After everything we've seen, the violence, the beauty, the contradictions, this last chapter isn't about another scandal or grave. It's about the echo, the legacy, what survives when the songs stop. Because the Viking Age ended eventually. The raiding slowed, the kings Christianized, the gods were pushed into myth, and the rituals faded into shadow. But what about sex? What about love? What did the Norse leave behind, not in Stega's car, but in the bones of culture itself? Let's start with something we rarely talk about in historical narratives, the aftermath. When Christianity began its slow conquest of Scandinavia, it didn't just build churches, it rewired morality. Pagan ideas of sexuality, fluid, sacred, practical, were suddenly cast as yms. Desire became temptation. Fertility symbols were recast as devilish, and those who had once served Freyja or Odin were labelled witches, perverts, or heretics. The old ways didn't vanish overnight. For a while, they coexisted. A Viking chieftain might get baptised on Sunday and sacrifice a goat to Thor on Thursday. A Christian bride might still wear her mother's pagan fertility charm tucked under her gown. But gradually Christian laws took hold, and with them, new ideas about shame. Virginity became a virtue, homosexuality became a crime, female independence became disobedience. And public rituals, especially those involving sexuality, were scrubbed clean. In Iceland, laws changed fast. The famed Gragas law code, written down in the 12th century, was still soaked in Viking thought, but heavily influenced by Christian doctrine. Adultery became punishable by fines or flogging. Sexual insults were no longer settled by poetry duels, but by church courts. Rape, still inconsistently punished. But now it came with added layers of moral judgment. Not just a violation of honour, but a sin against God, and yet the echoes remained. You see it in the folk traditions that lasted centuries longer than the gods who inspired them. Fertility dolls made from straw, springtime dances around phallic poles, runes carved into bedroom beams for protection, not from spirits, but from infidelity. People remembered, not always with words, sometimes just with gestures, objects, or old superstitions whispered before sleep. You also see it in the stories that refuse to die. The sagas, written down by Christian scribes, still preserve pre-Christian values. You read about strong women, seductive gods, and forbidden love, and you realise someone couldn't bear to erase it completely. Even if they had to dress it up in Christian morality, the old desire to feel, to touch, remained. Here's a fringe fact to savour. In some parts of Sweden, as late as the 1800s, farmers still invoked Freyr before sowing their fields, quietly, privately, sometimes with a wink toward fertility that had nothing to do with crops. They didn't say his name loudly, but they knew. The body remembers what the church forgets. There's also a scholarly debate about how much of Norse sexuality actually survived through oral culture, through lullabies, riddles, folk tales. Some believe that bawdy songs and stories carried hints of ancient rituals. Others argue that most of what we think we know is fantasy layered on top of fantasy. But maybe both are true, because memory is rarely clean. It's messy, fragmented, like a broken brooch you dig out of the dirt, still shining even if you can't quite tell what it once held together. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Modern people have been romanticising Viking sexuality for centuries. From the Victorian era, when scholars cherry-picked the noble savage narrative, to today's pop culture depictions, leather, braids, open relationships and fierce free women, the Viking world has been recycled into fantasy, sometimes empowering, sometimes deeply misleading. We crave the thrill of a freer, rawer world, but we rarely stop to ask what it cost. Because now you know, you've seen the underlayer. You've walked through the longhouse and the slave market, the wedding bed and the burial mound. You've heard the poetry, the accusations, the prayers. You've felt the warmth and the violation, the desire and the danger. And you know that Viking sexuality wasn't some one-note raunchy saga. It was a complex, tangled web of power, belief, control, magic, and survival. It didn't look like us, but it is part of us. The echoes are in the language, in the myths we tell, in the way we still link sex to shame and love to ownership. Even in the age of scrolls and screens, the questions they asked still hang heavy in the air. Who owns a body? Who decides what is sacred? What do we owe each other in the dark? So tonight, as the fire dims, take a breath. Let the story settle. You've walked the long road, through beds and battles, through rituals and laws, through the loud, brutal, sacred chaos that was the Viking Age. And whether you admire it, recoil from it, or just feel something you can't name, that is the power of history. It doesn't care what you're ready for, it just opens the door. So here we are, at the very end of a journey that started with a smirk and a side glance at Viking sex, and somehow took us into blood feuds, funeral rites, forced silence, whispered pleasure, legal threats, sacred moans, and one or two extremely questionable fertility idols. You made it. Barely. And no, you probably wouldn't have survived it. Not as a woman, not as a thrall, not even as a chieftain. But you did survive the story, and that's something. The Viking Age is often sold to us as this rugged playground of freedom and adventure, where women were fierce and men were hot and everybody got to wear fur and drink out of horns. And yeah, some of that is true. But what's also true is that sex in this world wasn't free. It was controlled, it was ritualized, it was weaponized. Sometimes it was sweet, yes, sometimes it was private, but more often it was tangled in shame, status, power, and survival. The Norse didn't treat sexuality like a side note. They made it the centre of myth, the root of legal conflict, the fuel for magic, and the shadow that followed you into death. They carved it into stone, they sang about it, they used it to curse, to claim, to control, they feared it and needed it in equal measure. And isn't that still kind of true? In the end, we study their world not to be voyeurs, but to understand our own. How much we've changed, how much we haven't, how the same questions echo through time. Who owns your body? Who defines your worth? Is sex sacred, sinful, or just human? We've sat in their smoky longhouses. We've watched the gods flirt and threaten and cry. We've seen the way love could heal or destroy a family. And we've felt the way even the most brutal systems couldn't quite erase tenderness. A hand held, a name whispered, a ring buried in a grave. So maybe that's the real takeaway. That even in a world obsessed with dominance, there were moments of softness. That even in the harshest conditions, people still reached for connection, for pleasure, for meaning. And you, right now, maybe you're still lying there with the fan humming in the background, the lights dimmed, your mind racing. That's okay, that's the point. History isn't a place we visit, it's a mirror. And sometimes it shows us things we didn't expect. So take a breath, stretch, let the silence return. You've gone deep tonight. Rest now, you earned it.